Good evening to all and welcome to Byju's. I am Baswaraj. So I'll be taking up disaster management for this batch. Right. So I think I'm audible to you all. We'll wait for another minute or so and then we'll start a session on disaster management. Okay, hope I'm visible to you all and audible as well, right? So we'll try to understand what is this disaster management. Initially, we'll try to understand some basics of this. Then we'll check up what is expected in the syllabus and where this disaster management is seen in UPSC mains question papers. Right. So first, when we talk about disaster management, you should understand that what are the basic things you should be knowing before starting this disaster management. Hope that you might have already covered your geography perspectives. So the first and foremost thing is you should be good enough in geography part. You should be good enough in geography. More specifically, when we see geography, first section of that called as geomorphology. So you should be good enough in that part. That is geological aspects. Geological aspects. Right? Like plate tectonic theories, all knows that Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate and then it subducted beneath the Eurasian plate, which created Himalayas. And that region is active region, which is vulnerable for earthquakes. So such types of events are important when you are making effort in understanding disaster management. Some basic idea about geomorphology, more specifically, the geological aspects are important. Then, once you know this, you have to move on to understand the dynamic nature of landforms. Dynamic nature of landforms. Right? Dynamic nature. Now, what do you mean by dynamic nature? Dynamic nature means these landforms. Take an example of mountain, coastal areas, plateaus, valleys. All these are referred as landforms. So generally we say any feature on the earth which is having a particular type of characteristic and the size, we refer that as a landform. And generally, these landforms always keep on changing. And that is what referred as geomorphology. And more specifically, we define that as a process called as geomorphic process. So you should be knowing that geomorphic process because these geomorphic processes are responsible for altering, changing the events which takes place on the earth surfaces, which we refer them as hazards or disasters. So you should be knowing some aspects of dynamic nature of landforms. So you should be good enough in this part, what we say, geography, dynamic nature of landforms. Apart from that, you should be knowing certain terms, which will help you to write very good answers in the context of disaster management. So basics of geomorphology are important. And once you have done with the basics of geomorphology, then you have to concentrate on climatology. Climatology. And when you are reading about climatology, you should be knowing basic concepts: air pressure, pressure gradient, temperature gradient. So such terms are very, very important. Take an example of the jet stream, the nature of a jet stream. And the jet stream, when it is strong, it is moving very straight. The same jet stream, when it becomes weak, it takes the loops. We refer that as meandering and Rossby waves. Now, when it is straight, it is having different impact. When it is Rossby waves, when it is meandering, it will be having different impact. So you should be knowing certain aspects of some special type of characteristics structures here. It may be jet stream, it may be winds, local winds, or modification in the winds which have taken place. So you should be knowing certain terms and certain concepts in climatology. And apart from that, you should always update the things which are happening here. Update the things. Take an example of when you're reading atmospheric phenomenons. I'm using the term. When you're reading atmospheric phenomenons like cyclones, right? So we have tropical cyclone, we have temperate cyclones, or mid latitude cyclones, or extratropical cyclones. Both are two different entities. You should be knowing that what are tropical cyclones, what are extratropical cyclones, and how they are behaving in the context of global warming and climate change. So you should be very clear in the conceptual part that what phenomenon you're talking, whether it is tropical cyclone or whether it is temperate cyclone, right? So you should be knowing them, and what is the impact of climate change on these cyclones, tropical or temperate cyclones. Apart from that, when you talk about the rainfall pattern in India, generally we say it as a monsoon. Now, what is the impact of global warming and climate change on the pattern of monsoons? So that becomes easy for you to understand and link that with the events called as floods or the droughts, or sometimes when we define heavy rainfall called as cloud bursting. So they accumulate all the concepts, and then we have to make an assumption of that. So you have to be good enough in concepts and updating that. Updating means where the cyclone has made landfall, where the cloud bursting has been done, what is its intensity in that areas. So you should be good enough in the climatology part. So you should be good in geomorphology, you should be good in climatology, in the term applications and current affairs, what we say, right? And after that, once you are good enough in these things, then you have to focus on current affairs, right? Now, what has to be done in the current affairs? It's very simple to remember. In the current affairs, you should be knowing about the events which have occurred in the areas where the event has occurred, where the cloud bursting has taken place, where the cyclone has made landform, and where it has created huge socio-economic losses, or where the earthquake has taken place, whether it is man-made earthquake or whether it is natural earthquake. So you should be good enough in accumulating the events, where they have occurred, when they have occurred, and what is the specific reason associated with these events. It can be tsunami, it can be cyclones. So you should be making an track of the events. Then you should be making efforts in understanding the development of science and technology in the context of disaster management. Sometimes they use the radars, sometimes they use many instruments which can make the identification of many events. It can be early warning system, or it can be disseminating the information in the context of global warming or climate change. So you should be knowing about the development of science and technology in the context of disaster management, right? Current affairs with reference to S&T. The third thing is you should be good enough in making understanding of the policies. Now, policies can be policies made by a concerned nation, and we also have important organizations, and these organizations like United Nations, so they make certain policies. So you should be knowing some rough ideas that what are international policies and what are national policies in the context of any such events. So generally we say action plans of such events during the disaster management. So policies can be national policies, or we say action plan, action plan, or it can be international policies, international policies. Now, international policies means at present we are having Sendai framework. Now, what is this Sendai framework? What it talks about, and from where it has evolved, and what is National Disaster Management Plan of India? What are the guidelines? What has been updated in that? So you should be knowing about these things. So events, where they are occurred, development in the context of science and technology, and policies. Then fourth one is you always come across the terms which are very, very important in the context of the environmental issues. Like we come across the term called as mitigation, we come across the term called as adaptation, we come across loss and damages. So you should be knowing exactly that what is the meaning of mitigation, where you will use that mitigation term, and where we will use that adaptation term, and what exactly is this loss and damage. What is this loss and damage? So you should be having that holistic approach, right? So for example, when you talk about mitigation is used in slowly reducing that. So it's a very long term process, 30 years, 40 years, where you are reducing that. And adaptation means behavioral change, changing the behavior of the society, changing the behavior of the people, and also adapting in the context of any disasters like cyclone. So we refer that as adaptation. Now, there are certain terms which are not covered in mitigation, not covered in the adaptation. Then where they are? So they are nothing but loss and damages. So once you have clarity on these terminologies, then you can use them in giving your answers, more specifically the way forward, or more specifically the conclusion to any answers what you are writing. So you should be knowing about the terms of global warming and climate change. It's not laborious, it's not that difficult. So once you keep on revising the terminologies, then it becomes very, very easy for you to make a better conclusion in your answer writing capacities. So you should be knowing the current affairs part. Then what else is important here? So apart from that, you should have a knowledge of a region. You should have a regional approach. You should knowing the regional approach. In geography, you have already read that, right? Now, what is a region? Region is any geographical area which is homogeneous in characteristics. Region is any geographical area, any geographical area which is homogeneous in characteristics. Homogeneous in its characteristics. Homogeneous means uniformities are there. If any advantages are there, advantages are there. If any droughts are there, it are seen there. So generally, when we read disaster management, we define them as drought regions, flood prone regions, cyclone prone regions. So hence, you should understand that it is a regional approach which is seen. And moreover, you should be knowing that these regions are not confined to any administrative boundaries. Take an example. If you are reading about the droughts, a drought can affect a part of Karnataka, drought can affect a part of Maharashtra, but you can't confine them to the political boundaries, or you can't confine them to the administrative boundaries. So hence, to make an effort, you should know that that particular area where the drought or flood has taken place is not confined to any administrative boundaries, but we refer them as a region. So in geography, a region is any geographical area which is having homogeneous characteristics. Uniformity of the advantage, uniformities of the issues there. Western Ghats is a region, drought prone regions, flood prone regions, right? So you should be remembering this aspect. Regions which are not confined to any administrative boundaries. West Pacific region, the countries which are all along the Western Pacific. Generally, we say the Western Pacific is most vulnerable in the context of all the disasters. Take an example of cyclones, take an example of earthquake, take an example of tsunamis, because it is a part of Pacific Ring of Fire, Japan, China, and all. So hence, we call them as a regional approach. So you should be knowing some rough idea about the regional approach, right? And what does region talks about? Region talks about two things. More specifically, it talks about demography of that area. It talks about demography of that area. Demography, or generally we say a human geography approach. So when you read the demography of that area, you will understand that what is the population of that area, what is the population of that area, then what is the density of population here, and what is the age which is there, whether more old age peoples are there, whether young peoples are there, or whether children are there. So you will get the structure of population here. Structure. Now, why this is important? Once you know the demography of that area, then while calculating the risks, while calculating the impact of disasters, this will help us to understand that why the losses are more there. Obviously, if it is overpopulated area or high density or old age population, then casualties will be more, deaths will be more, losses will be more. So this becomes easy for you to narrate and answer that why that region is having such type of issues there. So rough idea of demography is important, right? Then when we read about the region, we always talk about economic activity. So this region will have economic activities. Now what are the economic activities we are talking about? So economic activity, not in detail, but broadly we can classify them into industries and agriculture. So broadly we can define them into industries and agriculture. Right. Now, whenever any event has taken place, you should check that in which region it has taken place and what type of economic activities are there, whether it is agrarian based region or whether it is industrial based region or whether it is heavily populated area. And by that, you can easily estimate the losses and you can plan for the crisis in the later stage when it happens after the event. Generally, we refer that as crisis management or risk management. We'll see them, but understand this. So hence, whenever when you are reading disaster management, the things you should keep in the mind: geographical approach, within that geological approach, and changing context of the landforms, dynamic landform structures. Then you should talk about climatology, some rough ideas: pressure gradient, temperature gradient, wind patterns, Coriolis force, modification in the tertiary winds, why it behaves like that, impact of temperature and the pressure, how it behaves in the context of global warming and climate change, different phenomena. So you should be knowing that. And then current affairs. And after that, regional approach. If you club all these, then I don't think you will have any difficulty in writing good answers in the context of disaster management. Right. Now, coming down to the disaster management and in which paper you can find. Usually we can find it in the paper 3. The question from disaster management are in the paper 3. But if you see the last year's papers, you can find even in the paper 1. So you can find them in the paper 1. That is along with the geography part. So you can see them in both the parts, paper 3 as well as paper 1. So hence its scope is increasing in the context of mains writing. Right? So this is some rough idea about the disaster management, or what are the precautionary things you should do before the starting of the courses, or from where you should accumulate the information, from where you should type. Now generally when we talk about the textbooks, a normal textbook with the definitions will help you. Either it can be NCERT book, or you can go with the website of National Disaster Management Authority of India, where he has given very good definitions, and you can take the definitions from NDMA, some small definitions. Don't make much research on that. Take the small definitions from that. That is more than sufficient, right? And moreover, you should have linking that to the geographical approach. It becomes easy for you to write there, because here they don't want expertise. They want to know the answer in the layman's language, in the layman's language. So hence you don't have to put more expertise in that. Keep it as simple as possible by taking the small definitions, information, and accumulating them in the context of your answer writings, right? See, Prem, learning demography will make it too factual. I'm not telling you to read entire birth rates, death rates, and all. You should know the idea that, take an example of West Bengal. West Bengal is having high population density. Take Bihar, high population density. You don't have to remember the facts. You should remember that which is most populous, which is having less densities. And then which areas, take an example of Japan. Japan, you will find old age people are dominant. And if you take the developing countries or poor countries like say African countries and Indian, we find the childrens are more in the numbers. So hence you should have some rough idea about the content which is found there, right? So you don't have to go with the entire data of the demography, right? Okay. uh, Now we'll try to move forward. See, PDF will give you some idea about the data and all. And apart from that, you should update that with the current affairs. So here I'm giving you certain structures and certain concepts which I'll be discussing. Apart from that, you should update that with your daily current affairs which are seen, right? So next is when we talk about the scope of disaster management in UPSC. Generally, we find it in GS paper 3. Now here, some introduction of the disaster is important. What is disaster? What is a hazard? Certain definitions are very, very important. So I'll be making some definitions. And you should remember that there is a very thin line of demarcation between the definitions. They are very close to each other. They seems to be the same, but they are different from each other. So there is always a thin line of demarcation between the definitions. So you should be knowing what exactly is meant by the particular term in the context of disasters. So there should not be confusion in the terminology. So we'll try to understand the terminologies, right? Then types of disasters. What type of disasters are there? Whether it is natural or man-made. Then vulnerability profile of India. So when we talk about India, we'll make an assessment of what is the vulnerability of India, what type of hazards takes place in India, and why such events are there. So this has to be seen in detail. Then international perspectives, that is Hugo and Sendai framework. Then disaster management in India. What are the policies where India is having, which is aligned with the Sendai framework? What policies are there? What guidelines are there? What is the framework in the context of disaster management? So we have to make an assessment of all those. And apart from that, the act, which is referred as Disaster Management Act of 2005, how it evolved and what are its structures and what are the features of the Disaster Management Act of 2005. We'll try to understand that part, right? Then some institutions, factual data which can helpful in writing factual answers as well. So these are the topics which I'll be covering with some of the disasters, right? See, Dikshit will talk on that. Can mining lead to earthquake? Of course, when we say mining leads to earthquake, when it is unscientific type of mining, and that type of earthquakes, we refer them as induced earthquakes. So when I take earthquake, so please raise the questions at that time. I'll answer that. Yes, mining can give earthquake. And also, we have any events called as extraction of shale gas. That is also responsible for earthquakes. If you are reading the current affairs, California, in USA, we find that large areas are having small earthquakes, and they are in fact due to the shale gas extraction, generally referred as fracking or hydraulic fracturing. So mining activities, then shale gas extraction, they are in fact responsible for earthquakes, but we refer them as induced earthquakes, natural and induced earthquakes. We'll define that. You don't worry, we'll define that. Okay. Okay, so first we'll start, then once we complete a few topics, then it will be clear for you to take up from which point and what has to be taken. Don't get much stress. Be cool, calm, and composed. Okay. Now, when we talk about the event called as a disaster or hazard, we always come across the two terms called as disaster and hazard. Now, what is disaster and what is hazard? Now, any sudden event, right? So sudden event is also referred as catastrophic, any sudden event or any catastrophic event. Now this event can be earthquake, which is natural, any catastrophic event, which can be natural, that is earthquake, which is natural, or it can be nuclear accident, that is man-made, nuclear accident, which is man-made. So any catastrophic events which can be natural or which can be man-made, right? So these events have occurred. Now these events, when it happens, it always brings large amount of the losses, right? Now losses in the sense they bring injuries, death, loss of property loss. Sometimes you will find psychological effect also. Psychological effects also. So large amount of losses will be there in terms of injuries, deaths, property losses, industrial losses, agriculture losses. So generally we refer that as economic losses. Economic losses are there. And this event has taken place, say, in two areas. One, where habitation is high, where we find large amount of human habitations are there. Take in the context of India, it can be rural or urban areas. And it can take place in the areas like deserts. So it has taken place into two places. One is in the habitation area, and one in the areas where sparsely populated are there, like deserts are there. Now, when we talk about these events, catastrophic events, they always bring a huge amount of losses. And these losses, we refer them as socio-economic losses. Socio-economic losses. Right. Now, any event which brings huge amount of socio-economic losses, which brings large socio-economic losses. Large means I'm talking about degrees higher. If it brings large degree of losses, and the losses are such that the losses, when we talk about degree, are such that the local people are unable to cope up that. They are unable to cope up or handle the situation with their own resources, with their own resources. Right. Now, what resources I'm talking about? Resources means I'm talking about finance, which is there with them, or the food, or the water, drinking water, or infrastructure, etc. So they are unable to cope up the situations, unable to handle the situations with their own resources. And to stabilize, they need external support. And to stabilize, they need external assistance. Right. Such events where they are unable to cope up and the losses are very high, we refer them as disasters. And any catastrophic event where the losses are there but they are not that high, such events we refer them as hazard. So the definition will be any type of catastrophic event. It can be natural or it can be man-made, which brings huge amount of socio-economic losses. Now, what type of losses? The losses are such that where the local people are unable to cope up the condition, cope up the situation, handle the situations with their own resources, maybe finance, maybe food, maybe water, and which brings large amount of casualties, deaths, and loss of the properties to that area. And such event is classified as a disaster, or else it is called as hazard. Now, the idea of disaster management is to make sure that the hazard is not converted into disaster. This is where you have to understand the point. Hazard, where the losses are death, and when it increases in its deaths and all, where they're unable to cope up, then we define them as disaster. So disaster, unable to cope up with the resources. Hazard, where we are having the casualties are there but comparatively lesser. So this is the difference between hazard and disaster, right? Okay. Now, when we talk about the definition of that, it is according to the Act of 2005, it defines the same. Any type of mishap or calamity where it brings substantial losses to their life and properties, where they are unable to cope up with their own resources, we refer that as a disaster. So hence, it is a calamity or catastrophe that can cause huge loss to the life and property, and they are unable to cope up with the situation. That is the definition of the disaster according to the Act of 2005. Right? Or a serious disruption in functioning of community or a society causing any of the definition you can take up in the context of your answer writing. The moment when you're writing what is disaster, so you should refine any of this definition, either this definition or the earlier definition. Right. Now, magnitude, intensity, frequency, and damages caused by the natural disasters have increased. Now, this is very important point. Magnitude, intensities, and frequencies and damages caused by the natural disasters have increased. Magnitude means their area of operation. Initially, if you take 20 years data or 30 years data, the area of operation was very small. Floods and droughts were affected in only smaller areas, but now we find that they have increased in the areas. So magnitude means when we say their areas have increased, areas of operation have increased, operations have increased. Now take an example of few districts of the states were affected. Now 50%, 60% of the districts in the states are affected. So it means it has increased in the area. Magnitude has increased. Initially, when we talk about the droughts or floods, they were smaller in the regions. Now they have increased. Then intensity. Intensity means severity. Now the droughts are becoming more dangerous. Sometimes they can be dangerous where they can create famine-like conditions. Now, when we talk about that, we come across certain countries like Madagascar, where they say that possibility that it may be the first country which can have a famine due to the impact of climate change. Possibilities. So hence we find they are becoming not only severe, they are becoming more deadly in the context of their exposure. It can be a cyclone which has becoming more severe. The floods which is caused by them is tremendously very high. So hence they have become very severe. Frequency, their numbers have also increased. Initially there were 4 cyclones, 5 cyclones in Bay of Bengal, or what we say Arabian Sea. Now we find the numbers of cyclones have increased. The numbers of cloud burstings have increased, right? So the frequencies have also increased, the area of operation have increased, and their severity has also increased, and damages caused have been also increased. Why? Because change of the population structure. Now we know that the population has increased, all areas, global population has increased, then the damages will also be more. And if you see the economic activities, now there is large amount of economic activities which have been increased. It can be industries or it can be agricultural sectors. So hence the damages caused by the natural disasters have also increased. So hence the statement that the magnitude, intensity, frequency, and the damages caused by the natural disasters have increased compared to last few decades. Right. Then there is a growing concern among the people to minimize the impact. Yes, because of the awareness created by the programs and policies. Because of the awareness created by the program and policies. And here it is a work of many institutions where they are involved in making or bridging the gap between the know and not known people. So we find that that awareness has made them to reduce or minimize the impact of the disaster there. Right. And also we find there is a concern of development of technologies. Take an example of during the COVID. So initially, whenever COVID was there, we developed a vaccination, and that vaccination helped the people to minimize the impact of the disaster. So there is a large amount of concern awareness which is helping to reduce the impact, even though they have increased, but the impact is also reduced now. Then there is a significant change in their patterns. There is a significant change in the patterns. Yes, we can see the change in the patterns. Why? Because we find that the land usage policies or land usage pattern has also been changed. The land use has been changed. Land use pattern is changed. So initially those land areas were not having any type of economic activities. Now we find that areas we have constructed large dams. those areas where we are constructed large amount of buildings, those areas where we are started large amount of what we say tourism activities which are not sustainable. So unsustainable tourism activities, unsustainable construction activities. I'm using the term unsustainable tourism activities, unsustainable tourism activities, and unsustainable or not proper construction work. Now, any construction work, take a dam construction or any hydroelectricity project construction, we have to take environment impact assessment. Then we should go in the construction part. Now, many areas are there where we have made large amount of construction, and forget about EIA. We are constructing in the areas which are ecologically sensitive areas. Take an example of Uttarakhand. You might have been knowing the episode of the land subsistence, right? So we find land subsistence which take place or which took place in Uttarakhand, and everybody know about this, the Joshimat episode. Joshimat episode. So here we find significant change in the patterns where their population has increased, unsustainable tourism activities, construction activities have been there, and that is why the carrying capacity of that area has decreased. I'm using the term carrying capacity. This is an ecological term. In the environment, you come across the term called as carrying capacities. So the carrying capacity of that particular area has been decreased, and when the carrying capacity decreases, then that region becomes vulnerable in the context of disasters like the land subsidence which took place in the context of Joshimat. So hence we say there has been a significant change in the patterns, not only due to land use pattern, but also due to the impact of global warming and climate change. Also due to impact of global warming and climate change. Global warming and climate change. So hence, there has been a considerable change in the disasters, what we are watching today and what they were in the 20 or 30 years back, say 2 decades or 3 decades back. So this you should keep in the mind. So hence, when you talk about this, rough idea of region is important. Rough idea of demography is important. Rough idea of changing policies are important. So that's why once you know the region, then you can understand that that region is used by which type of development activities. And then it becomes easy for you to link that with the event and take a conclusion in the context of disasters. Is it clear? So this is a base where you should knowing. So they are being considerable change in the events which have seen in the disasters, right? If any accident like collapses of bridge which cause huge amount of casualties is there, yes. So when we talk about the losses are there, sometimes stampedes which takes place in the temples, right? So that is also called as a disaster when it is unable to cope up with that. So they are also called as man-made disasters when they are unable to cope up with their own resources. Man-made disasters. Okay. So next we'll move on to understand a hazard. What is a hazard? Now, the moment when we talk about hazard, it is referred as a potential. Right? The moment when we say potential means possibilities. So it is referred as a potential dangerous event, right? Dangerous event. It can be earthquake, it can be volcanic activity, or it can be subsidence. We refer that as dangerous event, or it can be any condition. Any condition, heat waves, cold waves, etc. We refer that as any condition, or it can be any threat like bomb explosion in the areas, reactor explosion. So any dangerous event, any condition, or any threat which can make an impact or which can bring the losses, that is personal loss in the sense properties, what we say, death, injuries, etc. So all these potential possibilities which can bring losses, death, injuries, or environmental loss. We refer them as hazards. And you should remember, all the hazards are not called as disasters. All the hazards are not disasters, are not disasters. But if any hazard, brings huge socio-economic loss, huge socio-economic loss, and the losses are such that they are unable to cope up with the resources, with resources, then we refer this as a disaster. Then we refer that as a disaster, right? Now, the moment when we talk about the hazard, this hazard can be a single event. Hazard, it can be a single event. Single event. Now, example, the drought which has taken place in the area, a single event. Drought which is in the same area or in one area. Drought, it can be single event, or sometimes it can be a sequence of events, or it can be sequence. It means followed by another. Now take an example of, if this is a mountain area. In the mountain areas, as we know that Indian plate has subducted beneath the Eurasian plate. So we know Indian plate had subducted beneath the Eurasian plate. And because of that, Indian plate is still grinding beneath the Eurasian plate. Indian plate is grinding. It is still moving beneath the Eurasian plate at the rate of 5 centimeters every year. Now, there are many events associated with that. Among those, one of the reason is that this creates large amount of friction. So this event create friction. So here the frictions will be there, and the friction is responsible for creating landslide. That is one event. And due to landslide, large amount of the debris will fall to the ground. And these debris, when they fall, if they are falling in the settlement areas, then they can fall on the electric wires there, which can create short circuit. And this short circuit can trigger the forest fire. So one event is affecting another. So it can be sequence of event. And apart from that, one more classical example I will give you. So in the month of October 2023, you might be knowing about the episode of Sikkim. So here in the Sikkim, there was a lake at the upland areas in the hill, and that lake is referred as Lonak Lake. Lonak Lake was there. And this Lonak Lake is a glacial lake. Now, in geography, you might have heard about what is a glacial lake. Large amount of alpine glaciers are deposited in the hills of mountains like Himalayan areas. We find them, and when there is a melting takes place in these glaciers, so they create a type of a water which is surrounded by the glacier either on the top or beneath. We refer them as glacial lake, and this Lonak Lake is a glacial lake where it has large amount of the water which was accumulated there. So in the month of October, there was a cloud bursting took place. So cloud bursting means heavy rainfall in the shorter period of a time. So this cloud bursting was on the Lonak Lake, and it added large amount of water. So this made the Lonak Lake to breach. Right. So this cloud bursting added the volume, which made the breaching of Lonak Lake. Right. Now, when the glacial lakes breaks, we refer that event as glacial lake outburst floods. I'll be discussing that in the later stage. So it created glacial lake outburst flood. We refer that as GLOF. I'll be discussing that. What is GLOF? right? So it will create a glacial lake outburst flood. So one is cloud bursting followed by glacial lake outburst flood. From which lake? Lonak Lake. Where? In Sikkim. And this event created large amount of water which moved to the lowland areas, which created flash floods, in the Sikkim, and this is what we refer that as sequence of events which are seen. So hence, any hazard, it is a potential threat condition which can affect a society, people, property, environment. We refer that as a hazard. And these hazards, they can be individual, like single event, or they can be series of events which can make the disaster or hazard more complex. So this makes the hazard very complex, very complex. So many times we hear that after the landslides, forest fires were there. After the earthquake, forest fires, which created drought-like conditions. So we refer them as sequence of events or series of events which make the losses. So hence, a hazard can be individual or sequence, right? Okay. Now this is the definition. It is death, injuries, right? Or it can bring environmental losses. It can bring environmental losses. And generally we say each hazard is characterized by location where it has taken place. Location means where it has taken place. That is, whether it is hilly area, whether it is urban area, or whether it is a rural area. So we take about consideration of location. It also talks about intensity, severity of that, how strong the event was. And it also talks about possibility of its occurrence. Say an example of when we talk about any events, volcanic activity, earthquake, or tsunami, how it can affect in the later stage, or what is possibility that next another 3 months we may have or we may not have that. So it has to be studied in these perspective: its location, its intensities, its frequency, how often it is happening, and its probability. It will help us to understand the event and make proper arrangement in the context of management. So hence, this is some rough idea about hazards. Is it clear? Okay. Can we say wars are man-made disasters? Yes, wars are man-made disasters. Take an example of 1940s, so where we find Second World War was there. So during the Second World War, atomic bomb was thrown in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and that is called as man-made disasters. Nuclear weapons are man-made disasters. Perfect. They are referred as that. A hazard is a potential threat, while a disaster is actual occurrence causing significant damage, destruction, and disasters due to hazard. See, when we talk about disaster and hazard, understand that any hazard which brings socio-economic losses, and those losses are such that the local people are unable to handle the situation with their own resources, then we classify that event as a disaster, or else we classify that event as a hazard. As simple. Okay. Now next, classification of hazards. Now how we classify the hazards? So generally when we talk about the classification, the International Research on Disaster Risk program has classified all the disasters into 6 families. The first one is called as geophysical hazard. It is also called as geological hazard. It is also called as geological hazard. Geological hazard. And these are the hazards which occur due to solid nature of the earth, that is lithosphere part. They occur due to solid nature of the earth. They occur due to solid nature of the earth. Solid nature of the earth. We refer them as geophysical hazards. The lithosphere, earthquakes, volcanic activities, etc. We refer them as a geophysical hazard. Then hydrological hazard.
Handwriting should be little bigger and straight. So it's asking.
Yes. Okay, so second one is hydrological hazard. So the moment when we say hydrological hazard, it is about the occurrence, distribution, occurrence, distribution, and movement. Occurrence, distribution, and movement of water. Movement of water. Where? On the surface and beneath the surface. Beneath the surface means subsurface, groundwaters. So occurrence, distribution, and movement of water on the surface and subsurface. Subsurface. We refer that as hydrological hazard, the hazard occurring because of these events. Then meteorological hazards. The moment when we say meteorological hazards, you should remember that they are very short-term events. So they are short-term events. So generally they are for minutes up to days. Their occurrence is from minutes up to the days. And these are because of extreme weather condition. They are due to extreme weather condition, or atmospheric phenomenons, or atmospheric phenomenon. Small to medium range. They are micro, that is small area, to mesoscale. Their scale of operation is very small to medium one, right? Then climatological hazard. Now climatological hazards are the hazards which are for a longer period of a time. So they are for a longer period of a time. Longer period. So generally they start within the season, that is intra-seasonal. They start within the season, called as intra-seasonal. And sometimes they continue up to decades. Intra-seasonal up to decades. We refer them as climatological hazards, and their scale of operation is medium to very large. Very large region is affected. So hence we refer them as mesoscale to macro scale. Macro means extremely large areas. They operate in very large areas. Then biological hazards. So what are biological hazards? So the moment when we say biological hazard, it is exposure to living organisms. These are caused due to exposure to living organisms. Living organisms. Or it is exposure to toxic substances. Toxic substances. We refer them as biological hazard. So generally vector-borne disease are also part of this, like plague, COVID, right? So we refer them as the biological hazard, right? And then extraterrestrial hazards, like impact of, say, meteorites, asteroids, we find. So extraterrestrial hazards, it can be impact of meteorites or sometimes asteroids. So all the hazards are classified into these, right? So it is about geophysical, hydrological, meteorological, climatological, biological, and extraterrestrial hazards. See, when you talk about this, first understand the flow, then we will classify them. What is that hydrological? But first understand the basics, then you will link them with the context here, right? So first we will classify them: geophysical, hydrological, and all. And I told that these hazards are individually and they are sequential. So when 2 or 3 events are there, sometimes geophysical hazard combines with the hydrological hazard and it becomes sequence of events, earthquake triggering some events there, and that becomes a complex situation. So hence I told in the initial stage that some of the hazards are there which are caused by only one action, and there are certain hazards which are having sequence of events. So any hydrological hazard may combine with climatological hazard, and it becomes a sequence of events here. So please understand these things. Okay. So when we talk about the fourth point, fourth point, climatological hazard, you can take an example of Pacific decadal oscillation, which takes place in the Pacific Ocean. So we have heard about El Nino and La Nina. In the same way, we are having Pacific decadal oscillation, which also alters the global conditions. So these are some terms. And if you want to take an example of that, these are the examples of the same. In the context of geophysical, it is mass movement. Now, what is mass movement? Mass movement in geomorphology, you have studied that. Mass movement is the movement of rocks and debris from the mountains under the influence of gravities. I'm repeating. The transfer of rock debris, soils from top of mountain downward under the influence of gravity, we refer that as mass movement. And many types of mass movements are there. They can be earth flow, they can be rock slide, they can be landslides, so they can be solifluction. So many types of mass movements are there. Then land subsidence, Joshimath, subsiding that area, earthquake, tsunami, volcanic eruption. So these are referred as an example of geophysical hazards, right? Then second one is hydrological part, that is floods, then severe floods and landslides, movement of the waters. Then meteorological, it can be severe storm or extreme temperature. We refer them as an example of meteorological, minutes to days, extreme weather conditions, heat waves, cold waves, etc. Right? Then climatological factors, longer period of times, where we say forest fires occurrence is seen from years to time. Then drought events, then this accumulates over a period of a time, then the glacial lake breaks off. We refer that as glacial lake outbursts. So these are referred as climatological hazards, where long terms are being there. Is it clear? So when you talk about these things, you should have some rough idea that what are climatological hazards. And sometimes when the forest fires are there, they can be due to landslides also. When the landslides take place, short circuiting can trigger forest fire. Reason may be different, but the event is forest fires. Understand this. Causes may be different, but the event is forest fire, which is disaster. Any event, when we say, it is having many reasons for that. It can be man-made reasons or it can be natural reasons, but the event can trigger large amount of losses. So you should remember this. Reasons may be man-made or they can be natural. So hence, sequence of events affect the hazards, right? Then biological, algal blooms, epidemic, and insect infestation. You can add pandemic also. Pandemic, like when we talk about any disease where it has spread on the geographical. So if you take the geographical extent of a disease, then we refer that as pandemic. And if large amount of populations are affected, we refer that as epidemic. I'll repeat. If large proportion of the population is affected by the disease, then we refer that as an epidemic. Plague was an epidemic. 60%, 80% of the people were affected by that. We refer that as epidemic. Now, COVID was spread in 50 countries, 60 countries. Then we refer that as a pandemic. So pandemic is when you take geographical extent. Epidemic is the population which is affected by that particular disease, right? So we refer them as biological type of disease, right? So these are some rough ideas. Now, they will not ask you in detail, but you should remember that what type of hazards are there. It is to create a mind map that how the hazard will become a sequence of event. How the hazard will become sequence of event here, right? Okay. Extraterrestrial means space weathers or near Earth objects. It may be meteorites or it may be any such events which collides with the Earth system, which can bring some socio-economic damages to that particular areas. Right. So when we say landsliding, understand that landsliding, land subsidence, when we talk about all these, I have explained that they are the part of the solid nature of the Earth, and mass wasting, when we say mass wasting is a concept what you have studied in geomorphology. Mass wasting is a term associated with the movement or transfer of the rocks and debris from height of the mountain downward under the influence of gravity. Now this movement can be of two types, fast and slow. If it is very fast, then we refer that as the sliding part. If it is very, very slow, then it can be in the form of solifluction or it can be flow. So it can be heave, it can be slide, or it can be flow. And different names are given to that. Rock slide, rock fall, very fast. Earth flow, mud flow, comparatively less. When the water mixed with the debris, we refer that as earth flow. When the water mixes with the mud, mud flow. When the frozen areas are there, take an example of Arctic region and Antarctic or alpine areas, where the melting of the glacier and freezing of the glacier makes the soil completely saturated, and that flows very, very slowly. We refer that as solifluction, and that is also referred as mass wasting. So remember, all these terms are referred as mass wasting only, and mass wasting includes these. So that should be kept in the mind. So that's why I was telling that you should be good enough in understanding the geomorphology part, and then it becomes easy for you, right? So if you revise that, it becomes easy. Okay, now this is what you should remember. If you take geophysical hazard, it can be earthquake, mass movement of earth, etc. And here these are the secondary disasters associated with that. It can create landslide, it can create urban fires, it can create liquefaction, it can create mass movement of the earth. So earthquake, I'll discuss that in detail, so don't worry. I'll take what is liquefaction when I discuss earthquake. I'll discuss liquefaction at this stage. Don't worry, just understand that what it includes, what it includes. So this is when we talk about the main event, earthquake, and its sequence which can happen, right? In the same way, we are having volcanic activity, and India does not have any volcanic activity at this present. Initially we had volcanic activity when the Tethys sediments were subducting beneath. So initially we had volcanic activities. That's why we find certain rock stratas which are there in the Kashmir region. Ladakh batholith is a volcanic landform. It was formed when the Tethys surface was subducting beneath the Eurasian plate. So always remember, volcanic activities takes place when there is a subduction of oceanic plate beneath the continental plate, right? So initially that oceanic crust, when it was subducting beneath the Eurasian plate, during that stage we find certain rocks were formed there. Ladakh batholith, shock rocks, that region. But now we don't find any type of volcanic activities in the context of India, apart from one area where we are having the active volcano, that is Barren Island in the Andaman and Nicobar, right? And the other events associated with that, whenever volcanic eruptions takes place, which can trigger large amount of events. Take an example of the Hongo Tongo volcanic eruption which took place a year ago. It was a type of explosion which took place in the ocean, and it has added large amount of water vapor to the atmosphere. And this water vapor is a greenhouse gas, and that greenhouse gas can make change in the composition of the atmosphere, which ultimately affects the weather patterns or climatic patterns, which affects the weather based climatological incidents. So sequences events are linked with that, because anytime whenever volcanic eruption is there, during the volcanic eruption always we find the gases which are released, the water vapor which is released, the dust which is released, they are having certain chemical properties. They can make change in the composition of atmosphere, maybe in the regional area, but they will have an impact. And thus we have seen in the context of the Honga Tonga volcanic eruption, which was seen in the Pacific Ring of Fire, right? So they will be having large impact which will change the composition of atmosphere, right? And whenever there is a volcanic eruption, sometimes when the wall of volcano collapses, maybe due to phreatic explosion, phreatic means when the magma comes in contact with the water. I'm repeating, when the magma comes in contact with the water, that explosion is referred as phreatic explosion. When the magma, when it comes in contact with the water, right? So it becomes a superheated steam, and that steam can make an explosion in the volcanic areas, and we refer that as phreatic explosion. Phreatic explosion, and that phreatic explosion was seen in Tonga eruption. And whenever phreatic explosion takes place, there is possibility that walls of the volcanoes vent, or walls of the volcanoes will collapse, and they can trigger the horizontal distribution of water, which is referred as tsunamis, which we refer them as tsunamis. So hence volcanic eruption can also create the tsunami waves in the coastal areas, maybe due to phreatic explosion, which makes collapsing of the walls, which makes the collapsing of the walls here. Or these dust, they reach to the great height where the water vapors affect the composition of atmosphere, which in turn make an impact on the aerosol distribution. So hence they have different types of impacts, right? See, corona is man-made one. We'll discuss that later. Man-made event, right? Which is more powerful, hazard or disaster? Simran, understand that, see, hazard or disaster, if it is a event when the losses are less, we refer that as hazard. When the losses increases, we refer that as disaster. So hazard converts into disaster. Disasters will never become a hazard. So hazard is something where when it brings huge socioeconomic losses, there is possibility that hazard can convert into a disaster when management is not done properly. Okay. Mass movement. See, mass movement is your geographical term, Payal. You should understand that. It is a part which you have read in geomorphology. In the mountain areas, we find large amount of rocks, debris are there. They are transferred downward. So these rocks, the soils, when they are transferred downward under the influence of gravity, under the influence of gravity, we refer that as mass movement. And this mass movement can be fast in some areas, like landslide. Suddenly the rock debris fall. Or sometimes when these rock debris, when they combine with the water, then they move very, very slowly. We refer that as earth flow. Earth flow. Now, sometimes in the areas where we have glaciers are there, so the melting and freezing of the ice, melting and freezing of the ice, that makes the rock or the soil saturated with the water, continuously freezing, continuously melting, which makes the saturation of soil. Now, when the soil is saturated, that bulk of soil, when it is moving down, we refer that as solifluction. We refer this as solifluction. Solifluction. And all are mass movement. Is it clear? Okay. So phreatic explosion means simple. Magma is having a temperature of more than 1500 or 2000 degrees centigrades. Now this high temperature magma, when it comes in contact with the water, so it will make the water to heat, superheated water or a steam, and this steam explodes. And this explosion is referred as phreatic explosion. And this takes place when the magma comes in contact with the water, maybe undersea volcano or the surface where the magma reaches to the water part. Clear? Okay. Then we have something called as tsunamis. Tsunamis means huge displacement of the water, and we will discuss about tsunamis in detail because India is vulnerable for tsunamis, right? So we'll discuss about tsunamis in detail. Reasons are different, maybe earthquake, maybe volcanic eruption, maybe any type of event. We will discuss tsunamis in detail, right? Don't worry, we will discuss this in detail. Then when we talk about hydrological, it can be floods, it can be landslides, or it can be wave actions. Now just read them, you don't have to by heart them in detail. And the events of the activities are floods, coastal erosions will be there. Then debris which flows, we refer them as landslides. That was explained by me. Then again, flash floods, like the Sikkim, where we have large amount of water when it flows downward. We refer that as flash floods. We refer that as flash floods. Like Kedarnath flash floods of 2013, Sikkim flash floods of 2023. Uttarakhand flash floods. So we refer them as an event associated with many parts, maybe glacial lake outburst flood or maybe due to cloud bursting. We'll discuss that later. Right. Then wave actions, which may be due to impact of the ocean surfaces there. So these are certain terms which can be seen. See, when we talk about a pyroclastic flow, pyroclastic means solid debris, solid debris. So when the volcanic activities are there, remember during the volcanic activities, all the three types of eruptions are there. One is it erupts gases, it erupts liquid. Liquids which are erupted is nothing but magma, high temperature magma. And during the volcanic eruption also we find solid particles are ejected, and these solid which are erupted, we refer them as pyroclasts. The solid rock debris, we refer them as pyroclasts, or we refer them as tephra. Pyro, high temperature rocks. Clast means sediments. In reading sedimentary rocks you come across clastic rocks, broken rocks, we refer them as clastic rocks. So pyroclast means high temperature of the rock. So pyroclast or tephras are the solid parts which are ejected or which are seen during the volcanic eruption. Clear? Okay. See, I have explained this thing. Pyroclastic means that huge magma, the rock strata which is flowing, we refer that as pyroclast. Right? Okay. Now we'll try to understand other parts. Meteorological, which we short maybe the minutes or maybe days, cold waves, heat waves, etc., fog, frost, etc. Right? I have given you the description of all those extreme conditions and all. So this is something where you have to be knowing them with certain ideas so that you can make a mind map in the context of your studies. Don't go in detail, but understand them. So these all are your geographical terms. Take an example of this blizzard. Blizzard is a cold wind which blows from Arctic towards the Alaska, towards the Canada, towards the USA. We refer that as blizzards, cold winds, right? So they all have huge impact on the areas there. So these all are your geographical terms. Right. Now, what are the types of natural hazards? So generally, when we classify them as hydrological hazards. It can be floods or it can be droughts for our references and for our studies. Or we can refer them as atmospheric hazards. They can be tropical cyclones, they can be thunderstorms, they can be heat waves, or they can be cold waves. We refer them as atmospheric, formed due to atmospheric composition or change in the pressure gradient or change in the wind velocities. Then geological one, mass movement, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, geological events. Then biological events, epidemics, or maybe due to the locust attacks. Generally, this locust attack we have seen some 2 years back, where locust is a migratory pest. Migratory pest. Generally, it changes its courses. It is generally when we talk about locust, it is lakhs of the insects, not thousand, lakhs of the insects, and they always change their routes. So they are known for changing routes. Changing routes. And these when they enter into the area, they make huge loss to the crops. We refer that as economic losses. Economic losses. Right. Now, we can classify that as a man-made also. So man-made hazards are industrial disasters like gas leakage, boilers, industrial fire. We'll see that later. Maybe due to errors or maybe due to accidents. Maybe due to errors or maybe due to accidents. Or sometimes maybe purposeful. The purposeful means, take an example of the bomb episode of 1945. That is purposeful, right? So man-made disasters can be errors or can be with purpose, wars with purpose, right? So chemical and biological disasters, we refer them as CRBN, and accidents which takes place. Generally, we say it is due to the errors or sometimes due to the intentional ones. So we find intention also, we find the accidents also, right? So natural hazards, man-made hazards. Now, apart from that, we also have something called as socio-natural hazard, right? Now, what is socio-natural hazard? I'll take the same example of the landslides, right? Now, if you take the Himalayan region, in the Himalayan region, because of its geology, in the Himalayas, as the Indian plate has subducted beneath the Eurasian plate, it always have a friction. It always have a friction. Now, due to this friction, the Himalayas are vulnerable for landslides. Landslides. And this is natural cause. Natural cause. Because of the friction, when Indian plate has subducted, it is moving, grinding at the rate of 5 centimeters. So landslides are inevitable. They are naturally seen in the Himalayas. Why? Because of geology and because of steep slopes. Because of its geology and because of steep slopes. Steep slopes towards India. So hence landslides are dominant in the Himalayan region. Now, when we talk about the human involvement in that areas, human activities. Now you should remember that any areas wherever human activities are there, we use a term called as anthropogenic factors. Anthropogenic factors. Anthropogenic factors. Human involvement. Now, what are human involvement in these areas? Human involvement is nothing but due to overgrazing in the areas, overgrazing in the areas, or deforestation in the areas. Deforestation means clearing the forests, maybe for construction activities like hydroelectricity projects, or maybe for roads which are being done. So maybe due to overgrazing or maybe due to deforestation, etc. So because of these, the landslides will accelerate. The natural event is accelerated. So because of these, we find the event of landslide is accelerated. It increases, right? So the area is having a natural hazard, but due to influence of the man-made, the intensity has increased, the event has increased, and such types of hazards we refer them as socio natural hazard. And this landslide is an example of socio natural hazard, where we say circumstances where human activities is increasing the occurrence of natural hazard beyond their natural probabilities. We refer that as socio natural hazard. The best example is landslide. You may get many, but I'm giving one example called as landslides. But when we talk about these socio natural hazards, you should remember that these socio natural hazards, they can be avoided. They can be avoided. Avoided means they can be stopped, or their impact can be reduced, or their impact can be reduced. Impact can be reduced. But how the impact can be reduced? How the impact can be reduced here? Right. Right. How it can be reduced? It can be reduced by wise management. Wise, right? So hence remember that. What are socio-natural hazards? So these are the natural hazards where their intensities have been increased due to anthropogenic factors. Man-made factors have increased the events of them. Cyclone can be a socio-natural hazard. It occurs, but human influence have increased them. Landslide is a natural socio-natural hazard, but they can be avoided, or they can be, or their impact can be reduced by wise management of a land. Take in the context of landslides, if you plant more trees here, if you make the regulations by taking a proper environment impact assessment and not to allow any type of construction activities in ecologically sensitive areas. I'm using the term ecologically sensitive areas. If you stop working on that, if you stop the construction working in that region, then you can reduce the impact of that, or you can completely avoid the socio-natural hazards. Is it clear? Okay. So this is the definition of the socio-natural hazard. Now next we move on to a concept called as vulnerability. Now what is vulnerability? How we define vulnerability? Now the moment when we talk about vulnerability, it is a degree of resistance to the impact of the hazard. It is degree of resistance to impact of hazard. Degree of resistance to the impact of hazard, right? Or another way to define that, it is inability to deal, or we say it is inability to deal or cope up with situation or event efficiently, right? So it is a degree of resistance to the impact of hazard, resistance to the hazard, or inability to deal or cope up with the situation or event efficiently. By whom? It is it is by people or community or society or environment, environment or environment. So hence it is inability to deal to the condition, either by individual or by community or by society or by environment. We refer that as vulnerability. Now any areas or any individual or any society, if it is having high resistance, if it is having high resistance, then that particular society, that particular individual will be having low vulnerability, or we say it will be less vulnerable to hazard. Now very simple to remember this: high resistance. If you take any individual person, if he is having high immunity, if he is having high resistance, then the impact of COVID will not affect him. I say it's not completely, but he is having good resistance during the COVID. We refer that as the vulnerability. That is, high resistance will make him low vulnerabilities. It can be a society. A society, if it is very well organized, if they are having all the sufficient measures, where then they will be having sufficient of resistance, where the vulnerability will be very, very less here. So any society, any individual, any ecology or any ecosystem, if they are having high resistance, then they will be less vulnerable in the context of hazards. It means losses will be less, casualties will be less, deaths will be less. Now this vulnerability, it depends on many factors. This vulnerability, it depends on many factors, or it is influenced by many factors. It is influenced by many factors. Now, what are the factors which influences the vulnerability? The first one is economic factor. Economic factor. Now, in the context of economic factors, a rich person and poor person. Now, when we have the poor persons, he will have all the possibilities to having more impact of the vulnerability there. During the heat waves, if we take an example, a rich person can have his air conditioner and he can survive in the extreme heat possibilities. But a poor person will not be having air conditioner, so he cannot have the resources which can protect him. So hence, the poor conditions or the poor people will always be referred as more vulnerable in the context of the hazards. It is seen even in the context of COVID also. The person who is affected by COVID, if he's having large amount of economic resources, he can take a treatment and he can survive, which can be seen in the context of economically sound people. So poor people are always have high vulnerability in the context of any type of hazards. So casualties will always be more when we take economic condition, rich and poor. Then second aspect is the geographical factors. Geographical factors. Now, what are geographical factors? If you are constructing a house, and if they are the areas which are referred as earth prone areas, if you are constructing a house, right? So in spite of having the warning that that area is earth prone and you are constructing the house in the earth prone area, in spite of warnings, you are constructing the house in the earthquake prone areas, then obviously this will be having an impact of earthquake. We refer that as geographical effect. In spite of the warning, you are constructing the home or house in the earthquake prone areas. Then we talk about political aspect. Now, political aspect means it talks about budget allocation. Any country which is having budgetary allocation surplus or more in the context of this, then they can make all the resources. So it is about budgetary allocation. Budgetary allocation. So that they can have large amount of resources, or the policies which the governments are having, or the action plans. So any country who is having large or effective actional plans, effective policies, then the vulnerability will be very, very less to that particular country. And if the country does not have proper budgetary allocation, do not have action plan, do not have the policies, then they will be high vulnerable in the context of the hazards. So it changes, or it is affected by the political consideration as well. Then it is also associated with the environment. If any environment which is degraded, then the casualties will be more. Degraded environment will always have high amount of losses which can be seen in that particular region here. Then social part. Now, if any society is orthodox, then it becomes very difficult for them or for the people to create awareness in that. Take an example of during the COVID, many communities, they were not ready to accept the vaccination. It is because of the orthodoxy part, or because of the awareness which was not effective in that area. So social factors also seen. It can be backwardness, or it can be orthodoxy societies where they are not ready to accept the changes which are needed for that. So hence all these factors are influencing vulnerability, right? And apart from this, when we talk about vulnerability, you should always remember that this vulnerability, it varies. Now, how it varies? It varies significantly within community. significantly within community. That is rich and poor. Significantly varies within community. Rich and poor. Rich people will have all the resources which they can use. Poor people are always vulnerable. Maybe barrier, maybe constructions are there, or it can be orthodoxy or very well society which can accept the changes which are there. And also it varies with time. This vulnerability, it always varies over the time. Over time. Just remember that during the initial phases of the COVID, we did not have large amount of resistance. But as the days progressed, as we had the vaccination, then we developed a strong resistance so that the vulnerability decreased over a period of a time during the COVID. So hence we say it varies significantly within the community, rich, poor, rural, urban, and it also varies over the time. And this is what we refer that as vulnerability. So it is to be known that higher the resistance, stronger the resistance, then that will decrease the vulnerability in the context of hazards. Is it clear? Okay. See, when we talk about the weightage of disaster management uh, in the papers, so generally we find around one or two questions will be there in your mains examination. Sometimes you're not surprised that if three questions are also there. So you can expect around at least two questions in the context of disaster management, and they will be linked with your geography part as well. So hence you can find linkage in the paper one as well as paper three also. So you will find a good number of questions from disaster management linked with geography. So hence I'm telling you, geography is a multidisciplinary subject where linked with geography they will ask disaster management perspectives, right? Okay, we can have a break of 10 minutes, then we can continue from where we have left.
ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಪೆನ್ ಸೈಜ್
ಅದೇ ನಾನು ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಅದೇ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು. ದೆನ್ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಪೆನ್ ತಗೋಬೇಕಂದಾಗ
ಆಡಿಯೋ
Okay. Welcome back to the session. Hope I am audible as well as visible to you all, right? Okay. So we made an effort in understanding vulnerability, right? Very small definition. So you should make the difference between hazard, disaster, then vulnerability, right? Now, next we move on to understand something called as this is the definition, the degree of resistance. Whatever I told, you can find here, right? Degree of resistance, which is being seen. It is characterized by person and person, right? So whatever I told, it is defined in these areas. So key causes are geographical factors. I told you about earthquake, economic factors, poverty, right? Environmental factors, degradation, etc. So these all are referred as the factors which influences the vulnerability. Always remember, higher the resistance, then the society, the individual, or that particular community will be less vulnerable in the context of any hazard. So the major idea is to increase their resistance, right? Okay, now we move on to understand a term called as capacity. Now, what is capacity? Now, this is also, don't get confused, this is also the same definition. The extent to which a community or the services, any definition you can use. There is no hard and fast rule to use any. So you can make use of any definition, right? So this content is sufficient for the definition part, right? Now, next we move on to a capacity. Now, what do you mean by a capacity? Capacity, in a very simple term, we refer that as strength or resistance. We define that as strength or resistance. Or we can say it is a resources, strength or resistance or resources. Now, to whom we are talking? Strength and resources which exist. Which exist where? With individual, right? Within community, within society, or within the environment. So strength or resistance or the resources which exist in the individual, community, society, or environment, so that so that they can cope up or handle the situation, or they can mitigate the impact, they can resist the impact of any hazard, they can resist the impact of any hazard, or they can recover very quickly. So all these things, coping up, handling the event, mitigating the event, resisting the event, or recovering very quickly, we refer this as a capacity. And capacity exists in individual, in the community, in the society, in the environment. We refer that as a capacity or resistance. Now, what type of resistance are there? What type of capacities are there? Now, this capacity is in the form of, it can be in the form of knowledge, human knowledge, or it can be the skill, or it can be in the form of infrastructure, or it can be in the form of financials, money, in the form of finance in the sense strengthening. If they are having abundant finance, then by default they will have great amount of resources by which their capacity can be increased. So it can be due to finance, or we say budget, or it can be due to technology, technology. Take an example of vaccination during the COVID, which has increased the capacity or resistance of a community or an individual, right? So it can be any form, knowledge of an individual, skill, leadership. All these make resistance very strong. And these are very important in the context of any hazards. So in a very simple, capacity means it is a strength or resources which exist in an individual or a group, which make them to handle the situation, resist the situation, recover with the situation, and that make them to reduce the impact of or completely uh, avoid the condition. Now, what type of capacities can be built? Knowledge based, skill requirement, infrastructures like large buildings, or environmental concern, leadership qualities, budgetary allocation. So all these will enhance the capacities, enhance the resistance. Always remember, increased capacity will reduce the vulnerability. Increased capacity, increased capacity of an individual or a society will reduce their vulnerability, right? So always remember that the main idea is to increase their capacities, so it will reduce vulnerability. Right. So when you talk about difference between capacity and vulnerability, remember that capacity means resistance, capacity means strength. Now if the capacity is more, if the strength is more, then that individual person, that community, that society will be less vulnerable in the context of any event. Now if the resistance of a person is more, if the resistance of a community will be more, so they will be less affected by the impact of COVID. Why? Because their immunity is very, very strong. So higher the resistance, higher the capacity, they will be lesser vulnerable in the context of events. So it is inverse what we say. The idea is to increase the resistance, idea is to increase the capacity of individual, society, so that they will become less vulnerable in the context of any type of hazards, right? Okay. Now when we talk about this capacity perspective, you should remember these things, right? Now we'll move on to understand a disaster risk. Now what exactly we are talking about risk? Now here you should understand the two terms, that is risk and crisis. You should understand these two terms, risk and crisis, right? Now what is risk and what is crisis? Suppose a person A is there, he wants to invest in the mutual funds, he wants to invest in the mutual funds. So before investing in the mutual funds, he will take up all the possibilities, all the positive and negative points of that, and by studying all that he will put money in that, and this is called as he is taking a risk where he is investing in the mutual fund. He is taking a risk when he is investing in the mutual fund. So it is the possibilities, the event, oh, sorry, the thing which is taking place before the event, we refer that as risk factor. After that he has invested money in the mutual fund, there is possibility that he may gain or he may lose. The moment when that person brings losses from the mutual fund, then that condition is referred as crisis. After that, whenever losses are there, we refer that as crisis. So any type of events, any type of activities which are before the hazard, we refer that as risk factor. And anything which is after the event, we refer that as crisis. So risk is calculating in the initial stage. Crisis is after the event. Risk is before the event. Crisis is after the event. So here, risk. So it is likelihood of losses, possibility of losses, right? So likelihood of losses or possibility of losses. So the moment when we talk about disaster risk, you should remember that it is the measure of expected losses. Measure of expected losses. Now, what type of losses? Losses may be because of injuries, maybe because of death, or maybe loss of the properties, economic losses. So it is the measures of expected loss due to hazard. Loss due to hazard. Very simple. Expected losses due to hazard, we refer that as a risk. Now, what is the principle of disaster management? Right. Understand this. What is the principle of disaster management? Now, as per the principle of disaster management, it says that whenever when you are making a management in the context of disaster, there, according to the principle of disaster management, you should recognize or identify the hazard. You should identify or recognize the hazard associated with that. You should identify or, sorry, identify or recognize the risk associated with the hazard. Identify or recognize the risk associated with the hazard and try to minimize that. And try to minimize that. Try to minimize that. So that is the principle of disaster management. Now, what is disaster risk management? What is risk management, or how the risk management is done? Right. Sometimes they may ask, what is principle of disaster management and what is risk management? So during the risk management, you have to make the analysis and assessment of the hazard. Analysis or assessment of hazard. Now here you should always use the term hazard, not disaster, because once it has become disasters, then you can't call it as a risk factor. Hazard is seen. You should make sure that the hazard is not converted into a disaster. So hence it is analysis and assessment of the hazard. Then once you assess, you will have all plus and minus that. And once you are having the analysis and assessment of the hazard, then implementation. Implementation. Now what you are implementing? You are implementing the strategies and specific actions. Strategies and specific action. Right. Now, what is the role of strategies and action or specific action in the context of risk management? Whenever when we apply the strategies, maybe they can be structural measures, or maybe they can be engineering works, or maybe they can be medicinal work, or maybe they can be any type of policies which we are talking. So it is implementation of strategies and the specific actions to control or reduce. Control as far as possible any hazard, reduce as far as possible, or transfer the risk. Transfer the risk. So this is the management which is seen in the context of risk. Now understand, risk is, whenever when we talk about risk, you should remember it is expected losses. You calculate that before the event which takes place, or losses due to that hazard in the terms of deaths, injuries, properties. We refer that as risk, initial stage. Now, the principle of disaster management is to identify such type of risks. It can be any type of risks and try to minimize them. And in the disaster management or risk management, you have to assess and analyze that hazard and then implement the strategies and action plan which can be taken in the community, society, or the individual aspects, so that you can control, reduce, or transfer the risk. Now, this can be environmental concern, or it can be a societal concern, or it can be the community concern, which is, we refer that as the principle and the risk management approach of any disaster part. Monetary disasters that affect much of the populations also included in disaster. Yes, of course. So whenever when we talk about monetary aspects, so monetary aspects means budgets. Monetary aspects means allocation of the funds which are given. And again, when you talk about vulnerability, yes, the richer and poor people, where they are having different degrees of vulnerabilities in the context of any hazards, right? Higher the capacity, lesser they are vulnerable. Perfect. Perfect. So higher the capacity, lesser they are vulnerable in the context of any hazard. So the idea is to increase resistance, increase their capacities, right? Okay. Risk transfer means sometimes when we talk about, say, any area is having a drought-like condition, then the drought burden will be there in the farmers. So the risk transfer means you will be providing a financial assistance in the name of, say, insurance. Right. So risk transfer means insurance. Insurance. So we refer this as an aspect of Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, where the crops will be covered under that. So anytime, whenever drought-like conditions are there, he will get the money. So the risk is transferred to the insurance part. So we refer that as risk transfer or this. Clear? Okay. Right. Now, climate change and disaster. Now, this is a conceptual part. You should read that and keep in the mind. The first one is, if the global average temperature increases to 2.5 degrees, then the most devastating storms are projected to occur twice as often they are seen. Now, you can use them in your conclusion, or you can use them while you are writing better introduction for your answers. So these are the statements. So with the increasing of the temperature, global warming, we find the storms will increase. Why? It is simple. Oceans are referred as major carbon sinks. Oceans are referred as major carbon sink. Carbon sink. And most amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide are absorbed by the oceans. And carbon dioxide is a best absorber of a heat. And this carbon dioxide increases the sea surface temperature of the water. This carbon dioxide increases the sea surface temperature of the water in the ocean or in the sea, and that is sufficient to make the storms more dangerous, because that will affect the pressure gradient and wind velocities, right? Then the number of people suffering from the droughts across the world will double what we are having. So droughts have also increased, maybe due to the impact of El Nino, La Nina factors and other factors. We find the number of droughts have also increased. And as the population has increased, then the people who will be affected by the drought-like conditions will also increase due to the impact of climate change. Remember, I'm talking about the impact of climate change on disaster. Now, you should remember that climate change and global warming are two different terms. Global warming means when the average temperature of the earth is increasing. When the average temperature of the earth is increasing, we refer that as global warming. What is climate change? Climate change means when you take a statistical data, say temperature, when you take a statistical data of temperature, precipitation, humidity, etc. And these data, when you calculate for a longer period of a time, say 30 years data, 30 years data, then we refer that as a climate. Now, when these data change, when there is change in these data, we refer that as climate change. Now, climate change, when we say, if you take an example of temperature, now there is possibility that in the temperature aspect of climate change, the temperature can increase or the temperature can decrease. So here the temperature can increase also and the temperature can decrease. Both the possibilities are there. Both the possibilities are there. It can increase or it can decrease. So that is called as the climate change, increasing or decreasing aspect. Of the long-term data, we refer that as climate change. And if only the temperature is increasing, if only the temperature increasing, then we refer that as global warming. And there we are not talking about decreasing of temperature. So please understand, global warming is a part of climate change, where in the global warming, it is only the increasing temperature. Whereas in the climate change, even the decreasing temperature is also taken into consideration. Right. So I am talking about impact of climate change and disaster. That is long-term change and how it is affecting the disasters. Clear? Okay. Now, for every 1 degree increase in the global warming, then we will find that the floods and other aspects will also be there. Now, what happens is, whenever temperature increases of 1 degree, then the moisture holding capacity of water increases. Now, these moisture holding capacities in the winds are there. They are moving on the surface of oceans. Now, when they are moving on the surface of oceans, then they will accumulate large amount of moisture, because dry air will have more amount of accumulation of moisture. It is just like your wet towel and dry towel. If you dip both in the water, then the dry towel will absorb more amount of water. So hence dry air will absorb more moisture from the surface of ocean. And this dry air, when it enters into the land areas, due to orographic impact, it will provide heavy rainfall. So hence we say, with increasing of 1 degree temperature on the ocean area or in the atmosphere, the moisture holding capacity increases to 7%. So 7% of extra moisture the air will hold, and that extra moisture will provide heavy rainfall. That's make heavy rainfall. Now, if 2% of the temperature is increased in the atmosphere, then it is 14% of extra moisture which is carrying. And imagine that extra 14%, when it gives heavy rainfall, it will be in the form of mini cloud bursting or cloud burstings, which can trigger floods, Is it clear? So remember, for every increase of the temperature, when they are traveling on the surface of oceans, they will absorb large amount of moisture, 7% at least. Then heat waves will also increase because of changing of the weather patterns. It can be El Nino, it can be La Nina. So the heats or heat waves have also increased. Then large amount of infectious disease have been also seen. Vector-borne disease like malaria, which can bring huge amount of economic loss. Now, don't make over interpretation of that. You can use these statements and put them into your introduction or in your conclusion part, so that you will have a value addition in the context of your scores. Right? Wildfires, so they can also be more dangerous because of the increasing of the climate change. Generally, when we say climate change, it is about the increasing in the concentration of greenhouse gas and changing the composition of atmosphere. It is associated with increasing of the greenhouse gas and change in the composition of atmosphere. So hence we say that this is mainly associated with extreme weather-based natural disasters. So the moment when we say climate based disasters. They can be cyclones, droughts, forest fires. So we refer them as the extreme weather based natural disasters. So please remember these points. Don't make over interpretation. Use them whenever you're writing any answers based with cyclones, droughts, floods, heat waves, or biological paths. Right. Okay. Then failure to mitigate the climate change. Failure to mitigate the climate change as well as failure to climate change adaptation. Mitigate means slowly you are putting financial assistance so that you will reduce the part. Now, example is, we know that greenhouse gases are increasing and the greenhouse gases are responsible for increasing the global average temperature. Now, the mitigation of the climate change means you have to infuse the funds there so that you should, in the longer term, the usage of the fossil fuels should be reduced and clean energy should be done. So it means slowly you are mitigating the usage of fossil fuels, so that slowly you are reducing the release of greenhouse gas. It takes 20 years, 30 years, etc. We refer that as mitigation of the climate change. If you start working today, so maybe after 20 years, 30 years, the amount of greenhouse gas emission can be lesser part. And when it is less at 20 or 30 years later, then it will be easy for the people to adapt because the severity will be less. Severity will be less there. So hence they say, if failure in the mitigation of the climate change, and if we don't have proper adaptation, that is adapting to the impact of the climate change disasters like cyclones or changed in the behavior, then you will always have large amount of the biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapses will be seen. And we have already seen many examples of that where the biodiversity is shrinking. So at present, if you are taking in the global perspective, three major issues what the earth is facing. One is the impact of climate change. Second major issue is loss of biodiversity. And third major problem which the earth is facing is, one is climate change, second one is loss of biodiversity, third is land degradation. Land degradation. So these are the three major issues what the earth is facing. Now every year UPSC asks one or two questions, or in fact three you can expect from these: climate change, loss of biodiversity, and land degradation. So hence we say it is crisis. It is the crisis. And when we see these things, land degradation and loss of biodiversity, they will always affect the capacities. They make the people more vulnerable when their capacity itself are reduced. So hence remember that in a broader perspective, three major issues what the earth is facing: climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. If you remember these 3 points, then you can write something associated with the terminologies. Okay. Then the natural disasters and extreme weather events is also the most risk. Extreme weather events. Extreme weather events means cyclones or cloud bursting, etc. So they will also have a huge impact on the society and the people. And this is through this report called as World Economic Report. Very important report. Very important report. So World Economic Forum has said that because of mismanagement of the mitigation and because of less adaptation and increasing of the temperature, we find that extreme weather conditions and all those will make huge socio-economic loss. It is something which we refer them as a global risk. What is global risk? Sometimes they may ask. It is defined as possibility of occurrence of an event which could negatively impact the global gross domestic product, population, or natural resources. So the same thing applied to the global forum. The same thing applied to the global forum. Global GDP, it means economic losses. Population, casualties and deaths. Natural resources, forests, water, lands, all those. So there will be a huge impact on these. So hence, there is a strong need that we should make a very possibly a strong and positive efforts to reduce the impact of climate change, or else it is something that the United Nations chairman said that we are digging our own coffins, right? Okay. Now, disaster management in the context of India, when we see in India, we find cold waves are there. India is a country which is affected by cold waves, heat waves, lightning, heavy rains, cyclonic storms. So all these types of disasters are there in the context of India. Now, if you take the state of Odisha, Odisha is affected by cyclonic storms, floods, heavy rainfall. So I have given you the chart where it talks about which type of the hazards or disasters are seen in the context of the country, right? Every state wise. Now, if you take the state wise, Andhra Pradesh, and these are the types of disasters. So if you see Andhra Pradesh is having more amount of heat waves. And if you take Odisha, Odisha is a state which is having floods, and it is having lightning impact, and it is also having heat waves. So here, if you go through them, you don't have to by heart them. You should understand that which state is having which type of hazard. You should understand. This is called as regional aspect. Which region of India is having what type of issues there, right? So you should always remember these points. State wise. Now, if you are talking about Karnataka, so Karnataka and what type of hazards are associated, right? So just have some rough idea about that. Now, if you take the other states, say Arunachal Pradesh, in Arunachal Pradesh, we always have floods are dominant, then cold waves are dominant. So this is a average way in which the impacts are seen, right? So if you take Mizoram, so Mizoram is always affected with heavy floods or heavy rainfalls in that. So this is where we talk about the data. I'm giving you, Pavitra, I'm giving you an rough ideology that where and which states are vulnerable to which type of disasters. I'm giving you the vulnerability of the hazards to the states. It means which state has which possible type of hazards which are seen there. And again I am telling you that these are the events which are dynamic in nature, which varies over a period of a time. So 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 years will not be having much impact, but when it changes for a longer period of a time, then it becomes a longer cause of concern. Okay. Now, vulnerability profile of entire India. I have given you some idea. Now we'll try to understand why and how the vulnerability is seen in the context of India. Now, to understand this, you should remember certain aspects. Certain aspects. Now, when we talk about India, when you talk about India, when it is geological makeup, we always find that India is having two geological regimes. The peninsular part is the oldest part. The peninsular part is the oldest part, and the Himalayan part and the northern plains. So they are geologically new parts. Geologically new part. So hence, India geologically it is very complex. India geologically it is very complex. This you should keep in the mind. Very complex geologically. And Indian plate has collided with the Eurasian plate. Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate, and that has created Himalayas. That has created Himalayas. Now, in the context of India, even though the Tropic of Cancer, which divides the India into two parts, the Tropic of Cancer, which divides the India into two parts, northern and southern, But the presence of Himalayas, which are seen in the northern side, which provides a tropical climatic condition to India. So presence of Himalayas, which provides tropical climate to India. So you should remember this part. The presence of Himalayas provides tropical climatic conditions to India. Apart from that, apart from that, India is a country. India is a country which is having long coastline, that is 7,516 kilometers of total coastline. Total coastline. Then, if you see India, India is seventh largest in area. Largest areas. And if you see population, India is also having high population. So at present, if we or whenever when we talk about the census data, we have to depend on the census data which is released once in every 10 years. So as per the census data of 2011, India is second populous. So as per 2011 census, it is second populous country. Second populous country. And then when we talk about the economic conditions, they are not uniform. India, economic conditions are not uniform. We find rich are also there, poor are also there. So economic conditions are not uniform. Not uniform. Then apart from that, India has high density of population. India has high density of population. At least in few major states. I'm not talking about all. Average density is high in India. Then when we talk about Indian perspective, when you talk about Indian perspective, seventh largest area, long coastline, economic conditions are not uniform, high densities, and India being a younger country where we find it is reaping the benefit of the first demographic dividend. It is a developing country. So here we find as the population is more, so we find certain areas where the old age populations are also there, and at the same time we find large amount of children are there. So the demography of India, when we see the demography of India, that is population structure, we find old age is also there, we find childrens are also there, right? And that means that they are most vulnerable in the impact of that. So you should remember geological part, and you should understand the Himalayas and its presence, which is making these aspects. Apart from this, you should also understand a report which was given by IPCC. I hope you remember what is IPCC. It is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, right? So whenever when we talk about IPCC, IPCC has given its fourth assessment report. Fourth assessment report. And this fourth assessment report, which was given by IPCC in the year 2007. In this report, it has said that it has systematically and clearly it has mentioned that due to the impact of climate change and global warming, due to impact of climate change and global warming, the tropical countries will be the tropical countries will be most affected, will be most affected by extreme weather related disasters, by extreme weather related disasters, right? Now what are extreme weather related disasters? They can be cyclones, they can be droughts, they can be floods, they can be heat waves, or they can be cold waves, heat waves or cold waves, or whenever when we talk about this, other aspects like gulfs in the Himalayas, glacial lake outburst flood. So we find such types of events are there. And if you see that India is having all the problems, including this, plus forest fires. Forest fires. So cyclones have increased, droughts have increased, floods have increased, and the events called as cloud burstings have increased. Right. So whatever the IPCC has told in the year 2007, we are experiencing the same. And India, because of the presence of Himalayas, it is having a tropical climate. And as it is having a long coastline, and all are there. So because of its regional part, because of its location, because of its demography, because of its economic activity, India is referred as a country which is one among, or which may say, which is one of the country which is most affected by the impact of natural disaster, which is one among the most affected. Most affected. So this you should keep in the mind. This you should keep in the mind. Is it clear? So economic inequality means rich and poor. The same thing I'm talking, right? So yes, now most populated, yes, we can say most populated, but you have to believe in the data which are given by or released by the government, right? So whenever the government gives the data, then you should remember those perspectives, right? Now whenever when we talk about this, you should unplanned urbanization is associated with floods. That is also what we refer them. So no proper planning are there. So when you discuss that flood, yes, it is there. So we don't have proper planning. They all are referred as the factors which are associated with this. Perfect. So this is how you have to make the data, right? So IPCC means Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Very important panel. And this has already released many reports, assessment reports. Sixth report is also being released, right? Now, this is something you should remember about India. So once you know this, then easily it becomes easy for you to remember the perspectives, right? Now, keeping these things in the mind, now we'll try to assess the vulnerability profile in India, right? Now, when we talk about vulnerability profile in India, the vulnerability profile is associated with earthquake. Now, what is the vulnerability of earthquake in India? If you take the total area of India, out of total geographical area, out of total geographical area, 59% is prone to earthquake. 59% is prone to earthquake. Earthquake out of the total area. This is about earthquake. Second one is about floods. Floods. Now, when we talk about the India's area, so the total area of India, out of the total area, that is 329 million hectares. Out of the total 329 million hectares, 40 million hectares, 40 million hectares, or roughly 8% of the area is vulnerable to floods. Is vulnerable to floods. I'm giving the data which is given by National Disaster Management Authority about the floods. Then, if you take the net zone area out of the total 329 million hectares, right? So we have 140 million hectares, which is referred as net zone area. Net zone area, where in geography you have read about two terms, net zone area and gross zone area. Net zone area is counted only once. Gross zone area is the cropping area which is counted as many crops which are grown in the same year. Kharif, Rabi, and Zaid. When you cumulatively add them, the total area which is covered by that, we refer that as gross zone area. And this gross zone area always varies, but the net zone area always remains the same for a longer period of time. So hence we use net zone area where the crops are grown, but it is counted only once. So out of 329 million hectares, 140 million hectares is net zone, and out of this 50% of net zone area, understand this, 50% of net zone area, that is 70 million hectares, is rain fed. Rain fed. It means it depends on rain. It depends on rain. And hence, these are the areas which are highly vulnerable for droughts. Highly vulnerable for droughts. So, important statistics. Now, fourth one is out of the total coastline, out of the total coast, that is 7,516 kilometer is total coastline. Out of this 5,700 kilometers out of this. So total coastline, which includes mainland plus Andaman Nicobar and Lakshadweep, 5,700 kilometers is vulnerable. For cyclones, tsunamis, right, floods, storms, etc. Vulnerability profile. Then fifth, so we made an effort in understanding earthquake, floods, then the droughts, then we talk about the coastal areas, then we talk about the landslides. If you take the landslides, 12% of area is the area which is vulnerable for landslides. So landslides are dominant in the areas like Himalayas, Western Ghats, and high elevated areas. Right? So apart from that, we also experience large amount of heat waves and cold waves. Apart from that, large amount of the areas in the Himalayas. Now remember, in the Himalayas, we find ice deposits are there. We refer them as alpine glaciers. And these glaciers in the Himalayas, which creates the glacial lakes. And in turn, they create the glacial lake outburst flood. Bluff. Glacial lake outburst flood. Now, this is the entire vulnerability profile of India. Earthquake, floods, coastal areas, landslides, heat waves, and the glacial lake outburst floods. So along with that, you can also say small areas of land subsistence are there, like the regions of Uttarakhand. Along with that, we also have small areas of land subsistence. Example, Uttarakhand. Right. So these are the vulnerability profiles according to the National Disaster Management Authority of India. Right. So heat waves and cold waves, not four types. Heat waves and cold waves. It is not four types. Heat waves and cold waves. Right. So when we talk about this, they may ask a question on, write a note on the earthquake profile or vulnerability in India and why we find more amount of earthquakes. They may ask, write a question on the vulnerability of the cyclones in the context of India and why we find more about that. Right. So the third point is, when we talk about out of the total land in India, 140 million hectares is net sown area where the crops are grown, Kharif, Rabi, or Zaid crops. Generally, we have two types of that, net sown area and gross sown area. When the crops which are grown, if they are counted only once, that area, if it is counted only once, we refer that as net sown area. And if the area is counted more than one times, like Kharif plus Rabi plus Zaid, which add up and create gross sown area. And gross sown area always varies from one year to another year. Net sown area means which is counted only once. And out of this net sown area, 50% is rain fed, which is referred as dry land farming, rain fed or dry land farming. Dry land farming. And this is an area where it is always have a threat of the drought here. So these are the vulnerability profiles of India. Now remember this portion, geological aspect. They may ask why India is vulnerable. You should remember this. Every year a question is asked based on these 2 points. If you remember this, the rest of the topics becomes easy. Regional approach and what type of events are there, right? Why India is vulnerable, and what is IPCC report says, and what type of geological aspects are there, right? And then keeping these things in the mind, easily we can say that out of 36 states and union territories, 27 are disaster prone, right? Out of 36 states and union territories, 27 are disaster prone, which are affected by the disasters like earthquake, which can be affected by disasters called as landslide, which can be drought, which can be floods, which can be heat waves, etc. Right. So this is how you have to narrate your answers. So remember, out of 36 states and union territories in India, 27 are disaster prone, which are affected by one or many type of disasters here. It can be heat waves, cold waves, earthquake, or droughts and floods in that area. Is it clear? So vulnerability profile of India, what type of events are seen, why India is having such type of cause and concern. This becomes a benchmark for all your answers what you are writing. Any answers when you are writing, you have to keep these things in the mind. Is it clear? See, you can depend on the PPTs what I am giving, because this is not from one textbook. I have taken it from many and added current affairs in that. So you can depend on National Disaster Management Authority or NCRT books also, or you can keep this PPT as a reference for making the notes. Right. Now, disaster management continuum. What we are talking in this point. Now, when we talk about a disaster, when we are talking about disaster, at this stage, you know that the disaster can be of two types, which can be natural disaster, or it can be man-made disaster. Natural disaster or man-made disaster. If you see the parts of them, man-made disaster can be avoided. They can be avoided. But if you see earthquakes, cyclones, we can't avoid them. So natural disasters, they can't be avoided. They can't be avoided. That is one. Second, when you are unable to avoid them, you can reduce their severity or impact. You can reduce their severity or impact. Again, in the man-made also, they can be avoided, but not all the man-made disasters are avoided. Apart from precautionary measures, some man-made disasters also occur, but they can also be prevented. Sorry, they can also be reduced. You can also reduce the impact or severity of natural as well as man-made disasters also. But how? How? It can be reduced. Either it is natural or man-made. You can reduce the impact of that by effective management, and a continuous cycle, continuum cycle or continuous cycle. Continuous cycle. Now this continuous cycle this continuous cycle, which consists of three key phases. It consists of three key phases. Right. Now, what are the three key phases? Three key phases are something what we refer them as what should be done before the disaster, or how you manage that before the disaster. We refer that as pre-disaster management. Pre-disaster management. That is first phase. Second, what you should do when the disaster has occurred. During disaster. During disaster, what are the methods? What are the management you can do during disaster? The third one is post-disaster management. What happens later? Post-disaster management. Right. So these are referred as the three phases. Pre-disaster management, at the time of disaster, and post-disaster management. Before, during, and after that. After that. Right. Now, when we talk about these things, always remember that before the event, when you are planning, it is referred as planning for reducing the risk. So pre-disaster management talks about risk management. Before, right? So pre-disaster management talks about risk management. Risk management. Whereas post-disaster, that is the activities which are after the disaster. After the disaster, we refer them as crisis management. So post-disaster management talks about crisis management. Crisis management. Is it clear? So when we talk about this, you should remember. See, I told about states and union territories. All the states and union territories combined within that the vulnerability profile I told. Right. It is in the context of India. It is in the context of India. When I say 36 states and union territories, it is with the context of India, including the new union territories, that is the state of Jammu Kashmir, where it has been divided into union territory of Ladakh and union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Right. So I'm talking about those parts. Is it clear? So remember that disaster management continuum is, we always have two types of disaster: natural disaster and man-made disaster. Man-made disasters can be avoided by many activities, good policies, but the natural disasters cannot be avoided. But there are certain man-made disasters, in spite of all the awareness, they occur. In spite of all the regulations, they occur. And then we have to reduce the impact of that. Again, in the context of natural disaster, we can't control them, but we can reduce the impact of the natural disasters. And that is through this cycle, which consists of three key phases. Pre-disaster, which talks about managing the risk. So as much as possible, you should reduce the risks. When you are unable to reduce the risk, then the event can create large amount of casualties, injuries, deaths. Then when you manage these injuries, when you manage these type of losses, we refer that as post disaster management, and generally it is crisis management. So risk management, crisis management. Clear? And thus three key phases is divided into these sectors, right? So pre-disaster management, which includes preparedness, mitigation, prevention. Post-disaster includes response, recovery, and development. So generally, in the post-disaster, we talk about resettlement, rehabilitation, recovery of the event here. Recovery to the people, recovery to the environment, recovery to the society. Right? So these are referred as the continuum cycles. So pre-disaster, post-disaster, and at the time of disaster. Right? So we refer this as risk management, and here it is crisis management. Crisis management. Right? So here the first and foremost in the context of pre-disaster management is prevention. Preventing it in the initial stage. So generally we say prevention is better than cure. So try to control that in the initial stage. Like when you talk about the event called as COVID, when you talk about the COVID. So during the COVID, if you use the mask, then it is outrightly rejecting or outrightly you are protecting yourself from the impact of the COVID. Preventions which are there using the mask. So avoiding the adverse impact of the hazards. We refer that as prevention. Now, then we talk about the second term called as mitigation. Mitigations are sometimes called as long-term measures. Long-term measures. So when you are unable to prevent that, we move on to the mitigation aspects there, like making vaccination. So after vaccination, you will find more amount of increasing in your resistance. Right. So mitigation means it is lessening or minimizing the adverse impact of hazardous event. Very long-term measures such as engineering works, insurance, land use planning, etc. They are long-term and generally they are some sort of permanent measures. Permanent measures. Now there are certain events which cannot be done by prevention, which cannot be done by mitigation. There are certain events which cannot be done by prevention, which cannot be done by mitigation. So when they are unable to be controlled by that, then we will transfer that to preparedness. It is transferred to preparedness. Preparedness. Like the knowledge and capacities of governments, professionals are required here. It is something like this. Using of the mask is prevention. Vaccination, mitigation. Constructing of the hospitals, beds, ICUs, and arrangement of oxygen, we refer that as a preparedness. Preparedness. So it is all are involved here. Communities, leadership qualities, financial possibilities, skills are required. So here we are talking about capacity building. Just recollect the definition of capacity. What I told, the same thing you can put here. So it is about increasing the capacity of individual, society, or environment. How? By providing the skills, by providing the knowledge, by providing infrastructures like hospitals, by providing the vaccination, by providing all things which can be used here. So we refer that as the three stages of pre-disaster management. Remember, prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. Prevention, mitigation, mitigation, and preparedness. Preparedness. Three terms you should remember. Right. Then, after that, in spite of all this, the event has occurred. We refer that as during the event. Now, before that, in the context of the pre-disaster management, in the context of pre-disaster management, we come across certain types of the disasters like cyclones, like cloud bursting, or heat waves, etc. Cyclones, cloud bursting, heat waves, etc. So these are referred as extreme weather-based disasters. So these are referred as extreme weather-based natural disaster. weather-based natural disaster. Now, in the context of extreme weather-based natural disasters, one of the advantage of monitoring them is, in this case, you can provide early warning system. During the extreme weather-based natural disaster, in the context of pre-disaster management, early warning system can be given. And it is very, very important aspect of disaster management, very important aspect of pre-disaster management. Pre-disaster management. Right. It is only in the context of extreme weather-based condition. You can't give early warning system in the context of earthquake. You can only say that that area is vulnerable for earthquake. You can't say that the area will have earthquake at what particular day or which particular year. You can't predict the earthquake, but you can easily say that that area is vulnerable for earthquake. That area is vulnerable for earthquakes. Hence, you can't say that 2025, 2026 when the earthquake can occur, but you can't, but you can say that that region is vulnerable for that. But it's not like the same in the context of the cyclones. You can easily give the early warning system that when the cyclone will make a landfall. You can give an early warning system in the area of cloud bursting or in the heat waves part. So extreme weather based conditions or extreme weather based natural disasters are there where the early warning systems are very, very important. Now, what is the role of early warning system? When the early warning system is given in prior, then the community will prepare accordingly. So whatever medicines they require, whatever resources they require, whatever shifting can be done, what measures can be done, deployment of the forces can be done. So within that short period of a time, maybe 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours, or a day, within that short period, they make all the arrangements so that the hazards will not increase, so that the impact will not increase. And that is where early warning systems are very significant in the context of disaster associated with extreme weather. And this we have seen in the context of, say, tropical cyclones. So in the tropical cyclones, one of the important aspect of early warning system is naming the tropical cyclones. Naming the tropical cyclones. Right. So this will help them to disseminate the information between the forecaster and the common people. Right. So early warning systems is very, very important. And this is done only when we talk about the knowledge of risk, and monitoring and analysis is also done. Monitor about the past data, present data by using the technologies. Right. And then communication and alert warning is issued. And this is issued periodically. Right. Like in the cyclones, we have 4-stage early warning systems. So when I take cyclones, I'll explain that what is that 4-stage early warning system in the cyclones. I'm giving an example. In the cyclones, we have 4-stage cyclone warning system. Right. Now, what are the 4 stages and when it is released? So when I take tropical cyclones, I'll explain that. Don't get much stressed. I'll explain that how it is released also. Right. So this is where they make their capacities. They increase their capacities to the event of the hazard here. So hence, early warning system plays an important role in pre-disaster management for the weather-based disaster, extreme weather-based disasters, not like the earthquake. Because earthquake and all, you should remember that they are the disasters you can't predict. You can't predict the earthquake. Right. So remember this very important aspect. Right. So in spite of early warning, in spite of preparedness, in spite of all, when the event has taken place, we refer that as the disaster phase. So during the disaster phase, whatever things you are supplying, we refer them as, we are providing them critical facilities. Critical facilities. So what are critical facilities? Medicine, food, clean water. Medicine, food, clean water. Right. So rescues, which you do there. Right. Search and rescues. All these are referred as the critical facilities. Now, when you provide medicine, food, clean water, rescue, and searches, then don't you think that the casualties will be reduced? So, the idea is to reduce or minimize the casualties. Injuries will not convert into deaths. If you are having proper medicine facilities, injured person will not become a diseased one. You will reduce the deaths. The injuries will not become dangerous, right? So this is during the disaster phase. Now, in spite of that, the third stage is called as post disaster management. So here it talks about resettlement, rehabilitation, which are very, very important. Resettlement means constructing the homes or any issues which have been done. Rehabilitation means providing them livelihood. And you should remember that this should be done as fast as possible. So generally we refer this as bringing the life normally, or we say it is build back better. Build back better. Right. So sometimes it can be short term measures, sometimes it is long term measures. Right. So it includes both short term measures as well as long term measures. But the idea is to make sure that whatever normal functionings were there, which were disrupted during the disaster, they should start working. So bringing the normal functions as much as possible, normal functions as fast as possible. Right. So we refer them as the post disaster management, and here entire machinery is involved. Entire machinery and expertise are involved here. Right. It is based on existing strategies, the area where the existing earthquake has taken, what they have learned the lesson. So after learning the lesson from that, they will use that. Right. So expertise are involved, all type of expertise you can find. Engineers are there, medicinals are there, local people are also involved, right? So they all will be seen in the disaster management. So remember, three phases of disaster management: pre-disaster, at the time, and post-disaster. See, difference between rehabilitation and resettlement, understand this. When you are constructing a home for a person, that is called as resettlement. Constructing a home does not mean that he will earn his livelihood. To provide livelihood, job opportunities to that, either by giving a land or putting him in some other. When he start earning food for him, bread for him, we refer that as rehabilitation. So it is not about giving the home. You should make sure that he will not be without the food. We refer that as rehabilitation. Right. Now we'll try to understand a first natural disaster in the context of India, which we refer them as the floods. Right. Now, the moment when you talk about the floods, this you have already read in your geography. Right. So, flood definition. The moment when we talk about a definition, right? Uh, can government go for portable houses to people after disaster instead of rehabilitation as a better measure? See, generally, when we talk about portable houses, yes, generally, rather than big shelters, portable houses are sometimes their advantage. But again, it depends on which geographical location you are talking. Yes, they can be accepted. It's not that it is completely wrong. It is faster method where they can be given. Right. So it is about bringing the life back into normalcy. Yes, it is seen. It is seen in the context of that. Right. Okay. Now, when we talk about the formula in disaster management, I will discuss that when I take few more topics, so that the examples will make you to understand the things very clear. Now, here, when we talk about the example of man-made disasters that can be avoided, right? So, the disaster of man-made which can be avoided is when we have something called as, take the simple example of nuclear warfare. When the US dropped the two nuclear bombs in Japan. If we had a strong international policies, then it would have been avoided. If you talk about the accidents in the nuclear reactors. If we had good amount of awareness about the technology, if we are having something which is foolproof in the usage of the nuclear fuels, if we had a good amount of the innovative technologies, by that we would have avoided the casualties. So remember that man-made disasters, they can be due to risks or errors. And if you are having proficient knowledges, you can reduce the gap and you can reduce the risk or accidents. And that is where you can avoid the man-made disasters like bomb explosion or the nuclear accidents. Is it clear? Okay. Now we move on to understand the first disaster called as floods. Now, what is a flood? Flood is when we say submergence of land. Any new land, submergence of new land. Submergence of new land. Or increase in the water level in already submerged land. Or increase in the water level of already submerged land. Already submerged. We refer that as the floods. Now, this submergence of a land or increasing the water level is temporary, not longer path. It is temporary. It is temporary. Such conditions, we refer that as a floods. Now, whenever when you're writing any answers on the floods, you should remember that in India, out of total geographical area, out of total geographical area, 8 so 8 percentage or 40 million hectares is vulnerable to the floods. Is vulnerable to the floods. Now, whenever when we talk about the floods, the first thing you should remember, they can be urban floods or rural floods. That should be kept in the mind. Right. So first we will understand the definition, then we will classify them. Rural and urban. Submergence or increase in the water level, we refer that as the floods. Right. Now, the moment when we talk about the causes for the floods, causes for the floods. Right. Now, causes can be natural. Causes can be natural. So what type of natural causes? So natural causes is heavy precipitation. Heavy precipitation like cloud bursting or mini cloud bursting. Heavy precipitation in a shorter period of time. Right. Or it can be due to storm, or it can be due to cyclone, a cyclone which hits or which makes the landfall in the coastal areas, or sometimes when we talk about the events which takes place in the orographic regions like Himalayas, Sikkim, etc., we refer that as cloud bursting and globs. Cloud bursting and globs, that is glacial lake outburst flood. Then rivers changing their courses. Rivers changing their courses. Now, the classical example of river changing their courses and creating flood is Kosi. Kosi is referred as Sorrow of Bihar. Kosi. It is referred as Sorrow of Bihar. Why? Because when this river is flowing, it makes high siltation. So due to siltation, it is unable to cut that. Siltation means deposition. It will make high silt deposits. After that, it changes its course. It will breach the embankment. Breach means it will break that and enters into lowland areas, which creates the floods. So hence, Kosi is referred as Sorrow of Bihar. changing of the river courses. So these are natural paths. Now, what are man-made factors? What are man-made factors which can trigger the floods? Man-made factors means construction of dams. Now, when we construct the dam, the water will flow. But on one side where the water is flowing, if this is a dam, and if the water is flowing in this side, so here the water flows, so there is no problem with the flow of water. But in this area, we find siltation takes place. Siltation takes place. Siltation means where it makes the deposition. Right. So earthquake is also something. Right. So when we talk about that, you can add events like earthquake can also trigger floods in the areas. So they are secondary events. They are secondary events. You can add that. There is no problem in that. Siltation. So when the siltation is done, then the river will become shallow. This will make shallow water. And during heavy rainfall, when the river has become shallow, extra water will spill outside. During rainy season, the water will spill out in the form of the floods during that. So dams are seen. Second one is deforestation. So when we cut large amount of trees, when you cut large amount of trees, so there a mass wasting takes place from the forest areas. The mud, the soils, the rocks, they move downward and they deposit in the river basins, by which the river becomes shallow. So the deforestation will make the rocks, the soil or debris, they flow down, and they also make the river shallow. Ultimately it creates the floods. So it is the shallowing of the rivers by man-made activities, constructing of the dam, or it can be deforestation, or sometimes when we make high siltation in the canals. High siltation in the canals. In the canals. Right. So generally there is a process that when the canals are constructed in the irrigation projects or the canals which carry waters, there is a process of desiltation. Desiltation means after the monsoon, after that, there is a process of removing the sediments from the canals. We refer that as desiltation. So when there is no proper desiltation done in the canals, then these canals will also become shallow. And again, there is a possibility of floods in the lowland areas. So we refer them as man-made and natural ones. So floods in India can be natural as well as man-made, and it is same in many parts of the world as well. Right. Next, what are the flood-prone areas in India? According to National Disaster Management Authority (NDMA), it has classified the entire flood-prone areas in India into zones. We refer them as flood-prone areas or zones in India. This is according to NDMA. The regions where we find average flooding, the regions where we find average flooding 4 to 6 weeks in a year. Average flooding 4 to 6 weeks in a year. In a year, we refer them as most frequent and intensive flooding. Now, which areas? They are Ganga and its tributaries and Brahmaputra. Right. So most frequent and intensive flooding, it is in Brahmaputra and Ganga. Brahmaputra river system, and 2 to 4 weeks average flooding is 2 to 4 weeks in a year. We refer them as less frequent and intensive flooding areas, and these are the areas which are seen in entire east coast, Bay of Bengal, that is rivers of Bay of Bengal, that rivers which ends in Bay of Bengal, and the rivers which are there in the northern side, that is the Narmada and Tapi. Then least frequent and intensive flooding. So least frequent and intensive flooding, where we find average flooding. Average flooding less than 2 weeks in a year. Less than 2 weeks in a year. Now, which areas are there? They are the rivers of Malabar coast. Malabar means Kerala, right? And the Satluj and Yamuna rivers. Satluj and Yamuna rivers. So these are referred as the three zones or three flood prone areas of India. But something happened in the year 2005. So during 2005, when there was a huge cloud bursting which took place in Mumbai, there was a heavy rainfall in Mumbai, heavy precipitation or heavy rainfall in Mumbai. And the events which took place after the heavy rainfall are totally different from what you see in the rural areas. The reasons were different. The impacts were different. The reasons were different. The impacts were different. And hence government decided that we have to create a new zone for floods, and hence accordingly the fourth zone was created. Fourth zone was created after the Mumbai episode, and we refer that as urban floods. We refer that as urban floods. So hence, see, when we talk about drainages or canals, remember that drainages means that the water which is flowing through the rivers. Drainages, when you are talking about, they may be smaller areas. I'm talking about canals which are larger. Take an example of the main river which are connected to the irrigation projects, right? See, Kerala floods, it is due to mini cloud bursting and other reasons were there. Kerala floods, when we say, it is mini cloud bursting and the geography of that area. If you see the Kerala cloud bursting, orographic impact, and the rivers which are flowing in the Kerala, they are moving or they are flowing towards the western side. And the rivers which are flowing in the western side, they are flowing through the steep sides and with high velocities, which made the conditions more worst. Which made the conditions more worse. So when you talk about the Kerala floods 2018, one is that it is due to mini cloud bursting, right? And second one is steep rivers in the western part of Western Ghats. Now, what happens is whenever steep slopes are there during heavy rainfall, all the water gushes in very fast and it becomes very difficult to manage. So when heavy waters are reaching in a very short period of a time, how you can manage that? So hence the Kerala floods become very, very worst. And why they receive heavy rainfall? Again, it is because of orographic impact and low pressure which was created. That is climate induced. Climate induced. Low pressure was created. One was in the Arabian Sea and one was in the Bay of Bengal simultaneously. So this low pressure which was created here, so these made the meeting place here, and that is where the large amount of the rainfall took place in that. And moreover, the steep water flowing in the western side made the conditions most disastrous, where they could not control the event. Right now, don't combine this. Just understand that entire India is divided into four flood prone areas. And the fourth one is referred as urban floods, which was added after Mumbai episode. Is it clear? Okay. Now, urban floods. So the moment when you talk about urban floods, you should remember that the definition remains the same. Submergence of urban areas or increase in the water level, we refer that as urban floods. So submergence of dry area by large amount of water, sudden excessive rainfall, or overflow of a river, or melting of the snow. Now, in India, we find many such conditions where the urban flows are there. Take an example of the Mumbai area. So, in the Mumbai area, we find that the floods are there. The urban floods in the Mumbai. One is because of the heavy rainfall. Apart from that, overflow of the rivers. Overflow of rivers. Right. Now, here, when we talk about overflow of the rivers, in turn, I'm talking about overflow of water from the lakes. Overflow from the lakes. The streams which connect to the lakes, they fill that and sudden water is reached. Now, why the overflow from the lakes? Because large amount of lakes are encroached in the urban areas. Large amount of lakes are encroached in the urban areas. Encroachment is done. Right. And when the encroachment is done, plus large amount of sedimentation is done there. Whenever any person construct a new house, he will bring the debris and throw in the lakes. So the lakes have become shallow. Encroachment has taken place. They have constructed large, unplanned construction, what we say. So because of that, the water flows from these lakes when the rivers are connected. So they are unable to maintain their volume. And the classical example of this is one of the reason for Mumbai floods, apart from heavy rainfall, is the discharge of water from the three major lakes there. That is Tulsi, Vihar, and Powai. Right. So we can find that even in the context of Chennai also. If you take Chennai, the urban infrastructure is responsible for floods there because of the debris which are thrown in the natural flow of that. And these flow I'm talking is the Kuam River, right, or the debris which are thrown in the Buckingham Canal. Buckingham Canal. Right. Or sometimes sudden release of water from the reservoirs. Sudden release of water from the reservoirs. Now, reservoir like Chambarkam. Reservoir. So this Chambarbakam reservoir is in the urban areas where during rainy season when excess water is filled, they release the water. And this release of the water is one of the reason for heavy floods in Chennai. And apart from that, recent incidences in the Chennai are due to landfalls of the tropical cyclones and the impact of La Nina. So during, sorry, El Nino. So during El Nino, the wind patterns also changes and Chennai receives rainfall. So we have evidences, not exactly, we have evidences that even the cyclones and El Ninos can provide rainfall. So I'm talking about encroachment of lakes. I'm just not talking about Mumbai. It is same in the context of Gurugram, the proximity near Delhi, where large amount of lakes have been encroached. And during heavy rainfall, there is a natural flow of water which is moving from the lakes, which makes the submergence of the urban areas. This is what we refer them as unplanned urbanization. Right. So melting of the snow, overflowing of a river or the lake, or exceptionally high tides in the coastal areas where the floods become inevitable. That is one. Now, why urban floods have increased? If you see the rural and urban areas, at the time of independence, the proportion of rural and urban was less. But now, with the definitions all, we find urban settlements have increased, keeping the criteria. of 2001 and 2011. So it is a natural increase in the urban areas. Right. So as the natural increase in the urban areas are there, so hence the urban floods have also increased, because the area has increased and the urban floods will also increase. So hence there is an increase. Right. So it is due to unplanned urbanization. It is due to not having strong policies, or it is again due to the climate change impact like El Nino or the cyclones which are there. Is it clear? Okay. Now, when you talk about the urban floods, what makes the urban flood more dangerous? The reason is it increases its peak from 1.8 to 8 times, and volume increases more than 6 times. So this becomes very difficult to manage. Very difficult to manage. Right. Now, the rainfall is very fast, like in the form of cloud bursting, like cloud bursting. Or maybe due to the heat or urban heat islands which are created in the urban areas, the temperature inversion, urban heat island, what we say, temperature inversion or urban heat island. Right. What happens is, if this is an urban area, if this is an urban area, and generally in the urban areas, the temperature of the area which is more than surrounding, we refer that as urban heat island. If the temperature of this is say 40 degrees centigrade, and the temperature of surrounding area is say 25 degrees centigrades, this is referred as urban heat island, which you have read in geography. Now, sometimes when the clouds moves on this area, when they reach to the urban heat island, then because of high temperature, it makes addition of the heating impact there, where they make strong condensation, because the clouds are lifted due to heat. The clouds are lifted up, and when the clouds are lifted, very strong, it undergoes condensation. Strong condensation takes place, and this strong condensation creates strong vertical clouds called as cumulonimbus clouds. Cumulonimbus clouds. And these cumulonimbus clouds provides heavy rainfall, and this is what is seen in many incidences during the Chennai episode. And this was seen in Chennai, urban heat island, creating havocs in the year 2015 and 2018. Right. Then denser population and slums. So as the population is high and slums are there, so vulnerability is very, very high. Vulnerability is very high. It means that the economic condition is not strong, and population is also more denser, so possibilities of losses are also very high in the urban. Then economic activities in the urban areas, we find large amount of industries are there. Industries are there. Now, when we talk about industries, they can be software industries, or they can be manufacturing industries. Right. So during the event called as floods, or during the events called as any type of increased water level, then there may be a possibility that electricity or other factors may be shut, and that is where it will make huge economic losses, because the important economic activities are closed. It will make huge economic impact. Huge economic losses will be there, and that may in turn affect the GDP of a country. That can affect the GDP if it is always happening for a longer period of time. Then, during the urban floods, vital infrastructures are affected. Now, what are vital infrastructures? So, whenever heavy floods are there, the hospitals will get closed. Whenever the hospitals get closed, then injuries will convert into fatalities. Second, roads will be blocked. When the roads are blocked, then emergency services cannot be reached. When roads are blocked, emergency services will not be reached. Like food cannot reach, medicines cannot reach to the area where they are affecting, and hence it can increase the fatalities. Right. So many vital infrastructures are affected. It can be hospital, it can be roads, or it can be any type of electric aspects. Railways, railway lines, airports, when they are flooded, then speedy arrangement cannot be done here. So hence the urban floods are different from the rural floods. Their causes are different, their impacts are different. Understand? Their causes are also different and their impact are also different. And because of that, we have created a separate zone for urban floods. So hence a new zone is created which is referred as urban floods after the Mumbai episode of 2005. Right. See, all these are very small. Potholes and all, yes, they can make injuries. They can make injuries. Now, when we talk about a way forward, so way forward, we will take up in the later stage. Way forward means the disaster management can be done. So at least we will take up 2 or 3 disasters. Then we will write about way forward. We'll see that how to write way forward. First, understand the disasters, understand the conditions. Then we can take up the way forward in the context of any disasters which we are talking about, right? So albedo means reflectivity of an object. Albedo means reflectivity. Albedo means reflectivity, right? Okay. So this is something about why the urban floods. So they may ask question, why the urban floods are different from the rural floods. Is it clear? Okay. So reasons we will take up tomorrow. So we have to explain these things. I'll take up tomorrow. So hope the classes was informative and useful to you. Tomorrow we'll meet up at the same time. And once we take up another two or three disasters, then we will talk about the impacts that. See, La Nina and El Nina, they are your geographical terms. So when we talk about La Nina and El Nina, after this I'll conclude my session. La Nina and El Nina are the events which takes place in the Pacific Ocean, which takes place in the Pacific Ocean. Right now, what Pacific Ocean you are talking about? Right. If you see this Pacific Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, that is where we are having North America or South America. This is South America, right? And here you are having Australia, and here you are having India. India. This is equator, and this is south of equator, right? So when we talk about that, normally here the ocean water which is upwelling, the upwelling here is referred as Peru current, and this is cold current. Cold current, say it is having a temperature of 20 degree centigrade. Now, due to ocean and atmospheric interferences, I'm using the term ocean and atmospheric interference. Due to ocean and atmospheric interference, that is combined effect of ocean and atmosphere, this Peru current becomes more colder. Peru current, it becomes more colder. That is around 18 degree centigrade. So when this becomes more colder, then we refer that as La Nina. When it becomes more colder, we refer that as La Nina, right? And reverse of that is also possible. Reverse of that is also possible. Again, due to ocean and atmospheric interferences, this Peru current becomes warm. That is, instead of 20, it becomes 23 degrees centigrade. I'm giving an example. So when it becomes warm, then we refer that as El Nino. El Nino. Now, if you are reading your current affairs regularly, this year, this year, in the year 2024, the Pacific Ocean has entered into El Nino phase. This year, we have entered into El Nino phase. And for last 3 years, that is 2020 to 2023, continuously the Peru or the Pacific Ocean experienced La Nina. And we refer this event as triple dip La Nina. Triple dip La Nina. Now, this is what you have to understand when you are reading geography. So, this is referred as El Nino and La Nina. So, the moment when we say El Nino and La Nina, colder water, high pressure, warmer water, low pressure, because temperature is inversely proportional to pressure, and hence wind patterns will change, which will affect the rainy seasons or other aspects. And I'll conclude the session. Thank you.